Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where the old world stays awake just long enough to tell you one more story before sleep. Tonight, we are stepping into the strange and watchful world of ancient Mesopotamia to meet a creature that is easy to call a dragon, but much harder to explain. It has the long neck of something that should not be trusted, the scales of something that does not care whether you trust it, the paws of a hunter, the claws of a bird, the tail of a serpent, and the deeply unsettling confidence of a beast that seems to know it belongs exactly where it stands. This is the Mushkhushshu, the dragon of the old Mesopotamian world, a creature that walked through myth, royal power, temple imagery, and the imagination of empires. Before we go any further, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. There is something fitting about that, because this story comes from a place where people watched the skies, measured the seasons, tracked the gods, and built cities meant to make human life feel a little closer to divine order. And if you find this journey soothing, interesting, or simply a nice place to rest your thoughts for a while, do give the video a like and subscribe. It helps this quiet little corner of history reach more people who might enjoy falling asleep somewhere between a temple wall and an ancient legend. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let the modern world loosen its grip for a bit, because we are going back to a time when cities rose from river mud, kings spoke in the names of gods, and a dragon could stand at the threshold of empire without anyone thinking that was particularly unusual. The Mushkhushshu is one of those ancient creatures that seems to arrive already carrying a problem for the modern mind. We hear the word dragon, and we immediately bring a full suitcase of later ideas with us. We think of medieval beasts sitting on gold, of fire and wings, of knights with very strong opinions about reptiles. We think of fantasy maps, mountain caves, treasure piles, and dramatic music. The ancient Mesopotamians, however, were not working from that script. Their dragon was not simply a monster to be slain, and it was not a random decorative animal added because someone thought city gates looked better with a bit of menace. The Mushkhushshu belonged to a system of meaning. It had a place. It stood in relation to gods, kings, sacred spaces, and the great machinery of order that ancient states liked to present to the world. It was not there to entertain. It was there to say something, and that is where this story becomes especially interesting, because the more closely you look at Mesopotamian civilization, the more you notice that animals were never just animals. Lions were not merely large cats with difficult personalities. Bulls were not simply muscular cattle having a serious day. Serpents were not just snakes. In the old cities between the Tigris and Euphrates, creatures carried layers of meaning. They could represent power, danger, divine authority, protection, chaos held in check, or chaos waiting for the wrong person to turn their back. The Mushkhushshu sits right in the middle of that world. It is a creature built from signals. Every part of its body seems to have been selected to speak a language people at the time could understand. Picture it clearly: a long-scaled body, a snake-like head, often shown with a horn, a neck that curves forward as if it is forever examining the human race with mild suspicion. The front legs often resemble those of a lion or another big cat, strong and predatory. The back legs are more bird-like, with talons that make the whole arrangement even stranger. Then there is the tail, long and sinuous, continuing the reptilian line of the body. It looks assembled, but not clumsy. Composite, but not confused. This is not a scribble from someone who could not decide what animal they wanted. It is deliberate. The creature is meant to gather qualities, to pull strength from different realms of life, to become more than any one familiar beast. That matters because Mesopotamian religion was comfortable with composite forms. Divine beings, protective spirits, and symbolic animals often crossed boundaries that modern categories like to keep neat. The old world did not always insist that a thing remain only one thing. In fact, power often appeared in blended form. A guardian could be part man, part bull, part bird. A demon might carry features that made it recognizable and impossible at the same time. A sacred creature could combine land, air, and serpent imagery into one body, not because nature had produced it, but because symbolism required it. The Mushkhushshu belongs to that habit of thought. It is a creature designed not by biology, but by meaning. Still, if you had walked into Babylon and seen it decorating the Ishtar gate, you may not have stopped to conduct a tidy little seminar on symbolic taxonomy. You would probably have stared. And that was part of the point. Ancient states understood spectacle perfectly well. They understood scale, colour, repetition, and the effect of being made to feel small in the presence of a larger order. They knew how to place images where they would work on the mind. The Mushkhushshu was not tucked away in a forgotten side room like a family embarrassment. It was placed where it could be seen, and seen again, and remembered. That should tell us immediately that the creature was not marginal. It had moved into the official visual language of power. There is also something wonderfully awkward about the Mushkhushshu from a modern perspective, because it does not behave the way we expect famous mythic creatures to behave. It is not always surrounded by dramatic stories of battle in the way one might expect. It often appears in association with order, status, and divine authority rather than pure destruction. That can be disappointing if one arrives hoping for constant chaos and non-stop ancient dragon action. But it is also much more revealing. The Mesopotamian imagination was not interested only in whether a creature could frighten you. It was interested in who controlled that creature, what god it belonged to, and what that association told you about how the world was arranged. And that brings us to one of the central names in the story, Marduk. If Mesopotamian religion were a crowded palace full of gods, with overlapping responsibilities and the occasional political reshuffle, Marduk is one of the figures who eventually moves toward the centre and starts rearranging the furniture. He became the great god of Babylon, and with Babylon's rise came his rise as well. As his prestige grew, the symbols attached to him also gained power. Among those symbols, the Mushkhushshu stands out. This dragon-like creature became closely linked with Marduk, and that link is one of the reasons the beast survives so strongly in the visual memory of the ancient Near East. Now, what does it mean for a god to have a creature like this associated with him? It means several things at once. It means the god has dominion over dangerous forces. It means he is not threatened by strangeness, but commands it. It means the creature, once possibly tied to older traditions or different divine roles, has been drawn into a more powerful religious and political framework. Ancient religions were not static museum displays. They shifted, absorbed, redefined, and adapted. Symbols moved, meanings thickened. A creature could begin in one setting and end in another, carrying old echoes while serving new masters. The Mushkhushshu is exactly the kind of being that invites that kind of long history. There is a temptation, especially in modern alternative history circles, to hear a name like Mushkhushshu and immediately push the creature into a much louder world of hidden codes, secret reptilian memories, and ancient witnesses to impossible beasts. Mesopotamia, after all, attracts that kind of speculation the way bright lamps attract determined moths. Mention the Anunnaki, throw in a dragon, add a ruined city, and before long somebody is drawing diagrams at 3 a.m. and insisting the whole Bronze Age was far stranger than scholars admit. To be fair, the Bronze Age was strange enough already. You do not really need to add laser eyes or lost off-world breeding programs to make Babylon interesting. But the reason those theories keep appearing is understandable. The Mushkhushshu feels like one of those images that should unlock something. It looks too specific to be random, too unusual to be forgettable, and too official to dismiss. Even without wandering into the wilder theories, there is a genuine mystery in how such creatures operate inside a civilization. Why does a culture imagine power in this form? Why combine cat, bird, serpent, and horned divinity into one animal? Why place it on major monuments? Why make it part of the visible skin of empire? Those are not silly questions. They point us toward how ancient people organised meaning. The creature is not just a fantasy animal. It is a compressed statement about authority. It says that divine power is not ordinary, not tame, not comfortably familiar. It is assembled from forces humans respect and fear. It watches. It guards. It belongs near the gods, and therefore near the kings who rule in the gods' names. Babylon itself helps explain the effect. This was not just any city. In the imagination of the ancient world, Babylon became a place of walls, gates, temples, kings, ceremonies, processions, and high claims about cosmic importance. It was a city that wanted to be seen as central. Not just rich, not just old, but central. The Ishtar Gate, with its brilliant glazed bricks and repeated animal forms, was part of that presentation. It did not whisper, it announced. When you approached, the images on it were already doing political and religious work before a single priest or official needed to say a word. The lions, the bulls, and the Mushkhushshu together formed a visual field of controlled power. This was order with teeth, and that phrase matters. Controlled power. Because in Mesopotamian thought, power was never safest when absent. It was safest when held, directed, and placed under divine rule. Rivers could flood and destroy, but managed well they fed civilization. Kings could wage war and kill, but framed properly they defended order. Gods could unleash terror, but in temple context they maintained the world. The Mushkhushshu fits that logic. It is not the comfortable animal of a peaceful pasture. It is a dangerous form that has been integrated into a legitimate structure. That is one reason it is so effective. It is not wild chaos. It is chaos domesticated just enough to stand beside authority and make that authority look even greater. You can almost see how well this would work on the ancient mind. A pilgrim, a trader, a messenger, a provincial subject, perhaps someone who had travelled for days. They come toward the city. They see walls. They see colour. They see scale. Then they see creatures they know and creatures they do not. The familiar already has symbolic force. The unfamiliar unsettles and impresses. By the time they pass through, the city has already told them that it belongs to powers beyond the ordinary human range. And if the dragon stands there among those powers, then the dragon is not merely a story. It is part of the city's truth about itself. That is one of the reasons the Mushkhushshu survive so strongly in modern imagination. Plenty of ancient animals are interesting. Fewer feel like they are standing right at the intersection of religion, political theatre, sacred architecture, and mythic memory. This one does. It has the visual grip of a creature from legend, but it also has paperwork, so to speak. It shows up in art. It shows up in places tied to real royal building programs. It is not just mentioned in passing and lost. It was made visible in durable form. Ancient brick can be surprisingly good at keeping a reputation alive. There is also the matter of the Anunnaki world, and here we should pause for a moment because that phrase carries more than one meaning now. In the older Mesopotamian context, the Anunnaki were a group of deities, powerful beings within the divine order. In modern popular culture, the term has been stretched, reinterpreted, dramatized, and in some circles launched into orbit entirely. But even if we stay grounded in the ancient material, the phrase, the Anunnaki world, still gives us something useful. It reminds us that the Mushkhushshu belongs to a universe crowded with gods, divine courts, underworld powers, storm gods, city patrons, sacred animals, temple rites, omens, and royal propaganda. It is a world where heaven, kingship, monsters, symbols, and administration all overlap more than modern people often expect. The dragon lives there naturally. In that setting, a creature like the Mushkhushshu is not out of place. It is exactly the kind of thing one should expect. If gods can rule cities, if planets can correspond to deities, if rituals can secure favour, if dreams can carry messages, if statues can receive offerings, then a dragon-like being attached to divine kingship is not a narrative excess. It is part of the furniture. Strange furniture, admittedly, but still furniture. The old world was not embarrassed by symbolic density. It liked a full room. And perhaps that is why the Mushkhushshu remains so compelling now. It comes from a civilization that did not flatten reality into neat categories. It allowed statecraft and myth to stand shoulder to shoulder. It let religious imagery become political messaging without feeling the need to separate the two into tidy modern departments. It gave its gods animals that looked like they had been imagined by committee, but a very confident committee, and it trusted viewers to understand that power might need to look unusual in order to look real. As we move deeper into this story, we are going to see that the Mushkhushshu is more than a decorative dragon, and more than a curiosity from Babylonian art. We're going to ask what it actually was in Mesopotamian thought, where it may have come from, how it became tied to Marduk, why it stood on one of the most famous gates of the ancient world, and what that says about the connection between fear, protection, and authority. We're also going to place it beside the other beasts of the Mesopotamian imagination, because no creature exists in isolation for long in a world this old and this layered. Ancient symbols tend to gather company. For now, it is enough to leave the gate just slightly open. The dragon is there, watching from glazed brick and old memory, its body pieced together from signals of danger and control, its role suspended between myth and statecraft. It has waited a very long time for someone to ask a simple question that turns out not to be simple at all. What exactly was the Mushkhushshu? If you were standing in front of the Ishtar gate in ancient Babylon, looking up at those long rows of bright glazed animals moving across the deep blue surface, one figure would probably slow you down more than the others. The lions make sense right away. The bulls, even if they look especially powerful, still belong to a world you already understand. Then your eyes land on the creature with the long neck, the horned head, the scaled body, the front legs of a great cat, and the back legs of a bird, and the mind does what the mind always does when it meets something that does not fit neatly into a box. It starts naming: snake, dragon, beast, hybrid, monster, guardian, symbol. None of those words is completely wrong, and none of them is quite enough by itself. That is the Mushkhushshu, one of the strangest and most memorable creatures in all of Mesopotamian art. At the most basic level, the Mushkhushshu is a mythological creature from ancient Mesopotamia, especially known from Babylon. That sounds simple enough, but the simplicity disappears the moment you try to decide exactly what kind of creature it was supposed to be. It was not an ordinary animal. It was not a god in its own right in the same way Marduk was a god. It was not just a random monster added for dramatic effect. It belonged to the visual and religious language of the ancient Near East, and the best way to understand it is to stop asking whether it was real in the modern biological sense, and start asking what it was doing in Mesopotamian thought. Once you ask that, the creature becomes much clearer. The Mushkhushshu was a composite being. That means its body was built out of parts taken from different animals and assembled into a single form that carried more force than any one natural creature could carry alone. The head and body are largely serpent-like or reptilian. The body is scaled, the neck is long, the tail stretches behind it in a narrow line. The front legs are typically those of a lion or another powerful feline, muscular and grounded. The hind legs are bird-like, usually shown with claws that look more like talons than paws. It often has a horned head, which in Mesopotamian imagery is not a small detail. Horns matter. Horns belong to the language of divine power. When ancient Mesopotamian artists added horns to a figure, they were not just decorating it, they were marking it. That is one of the first important things to understand. The Mushkhushshu is not strange because ancient artists were careless or confused about anatomy. It is strange because its body is made to communicate. Every part tells you something. Serpent qualities suggest danger, oldness, and a kind of controlled threat. Lion features suggest strength and royal force. Bird talons add speed, sharpness, and an almost unnatural reach. The horned head signals that this creature is tied to the divine sphere. Put together, the result is not a biological puzzle, it is a statement. This is a being connected to power that is greater than ordinary life. That is why it helps to think of the Mushkhushshu less as a dragon in the later European sense, and more as a sacred or divine beast. Calling it a dragon is still useful, because that is the closest word many modern listeners have for a long, reptilian mythic creature with an intimidating presence. But we have to keep the differences in mind. This is not the usual winged, fire-breathing dragon of medieval stories. It does not sit on a pile of treasure in a mountain cave waiting for a hero with a very strong jawline to arrive. It belongs to temple cities, royal building programs, divine symbols, and the public image of empire. It is a creature of authority, not just danger. In fact, one of the easiest mistakes to make is to assume that the Mushkhushshu was simply a monster. That is because modern stories teach us to expect certain roles. If a creature looks frightening, then it must be the problem. If a beast has claws, scales, and a horned head, then somebody is probably supposed to kill it by the third act. Mesopotamian thought does not always work that way. A frightening form can belong to order just as much as disorder. A dangerous creature can serve a god. A being that looks like bad news can still function as a legitimate sign of protection, kingship, or divine right. The ancient world was perfectly comfortable with the idea that power should look powerful. It did not need everything sacred to look soft and reassuring. That is why the Mushkhushshu becomes especially important when it is tied to Marduk, the great god of Babylon. By the time Babylon reached the height of its prestige, Marduk stood at the centre of a major religious and political system. He was not just one god among many in a casual list. He was the city's great divine figure, and the symbols attached to him mattered. The Mushkhushshu became one of those symbols. It appeared as his sacred animal or emblematic creature, and in that role it stopped being merely strange and became official. Once a creature stands beside a great god, especially one connected to kingship and imperial order, the creature enters a different category. It is no longer just an imaginative beast. It becomes part of the state's public meaning. And that is exactly what we see when the Mushkhushshu appears on the Ishtar gate. The gate itself was not just a practical entrance. It was political theatre in brick. It was religion made architectural. It was a statement about the city, the king, and the gods who back the whole arrangement. The animals on it were not there because the Babylonians wanted to turn the city into a charming open-air zoo. Each animal carried a divine association. Lions were linked with Ishtar, bulls or aurochs were linked with Adad, the Mushkhushshu was linked with Marduk, so when you saw that creature repeated across the gate, you were not just seeing decoration, you were seeing the presence of Babylon's divine authority written into the walls. This also tells us that the Mushkhushshu was recognizable. People in Babylon did not need a helpful little plaque next to it saying mythological dragon, please admire respectfully. They knew the image. They knew the association. The creature belonged to a visual system they understood. That matters because it reminds us that ancient art was not made for us. It was made for people inside that world. They saw more in these creatures than we do at first glance, because they lived in the cultural system that gave those forms their full meaning. There is another detail worth noting here. The Mushkhushshu did not begin and end only with Marduk. Like many ancient symbols, it has a history that seems to stretch backward before its most famous appearance. Earlier associations tie similar dragon-like creatures to other gods, including Ninurta and Tishbak. That tells us something very useful. It tells us the creature was not invented overnight by Babylonian public relations. It had a life before its most famous role. Symbols travel. They get adopted, reassigned, elevated, and reinterpreted as political and religious centres change. The old world was full of that kind of movement. When one city rose, it often absorbed and reorganised older sacred material, rather than building everything from nothing. So the Mushkhushshu that appears with Marduk in Babylon carries older echoes with it. That is one reason the creature feels so deep-rooted. It is deep-rooted. Modern readers sometimes know the creature by another name, Sirush, which comes from older readings used in early archaeology. That older form still appears in popular books and documentaries now and then, especially in the more speculative corners where ancient creatures are always just one confident narrator away from becoming living dinosaurs. But the name most commonly used now is Mushkhushshu, or in scholarly transliteration, Mushkhushshu. Even the name sounds old in the mouth. It has that rough, compact, ancient texture that feels carved more than spoken. It suits the creature. You do not expect something this odd to have a gentle name. And yes, people have absolutely looked at the Mushkhushshu and wondered whether it was based on some real animal remembered by tradition. That idea tends to surface whenever ancient art produces a creature that feels unusually specific. It is easy to understand why. The Mushkhushshu does not look like a vague blur. It has structure. It has a stable form. Its body plan is repeated with confidence. That makes some people feel that artists must have had a model in mind beyond pure imagination. Maybe a large reptile. Maybe a crocodile altered by myth. Maybe some fragment of fossil memory. Maybe, if one feels especially adventurous late at night, something stranger still. The safer answer is that ancient artists did what humans have always done very well. They took real features from real animals and combined them into a new creature that could carry symbolic weight. You do not need an undiscovered dragon roaming Bronze Age Iraq to explain why human beings with sharp eyes and active imaginations could create a powerful composite beast. A snake is real. A lion is real. A bird of prey is real. Horned divinity is real in the symbolic language of Mesopotamia. Put them together in a culture that thinks in sacred images, and the result is the Mushkhushshu. That explanation is less dramatic than hidden dragon colonies, but it also fits what we know about how mythic art usually works. Even so, the creature does not feel invented in a cheap or lazy way. It feels intentional. That is the key difference. A weak fantasy creature looks like somebody made it up in a hurry. The Mushkhushshu looks like somebody knew exactly what effect they wanted. It should be recognisable but not comfortable. It should have enough natural elements to feel solid, and enough impossible elements to feel elevated above the natural world. It should not look cute, and it definitely should not look easy to ignore. In a royal or sacred setting, that kind of creature does excellent work. There is also the issue of category, because modern people like categories very much. We want to ask, was it a pet of the gods, a symbol, a monster, a guardian, or an emblem? The honest answer is that it occupies space between those categories. Mesopotamian religion did not always separate those roles with the precision a museum label might prefer. A divine creature can be an emblem and still feel alive within the religious imagination. A symbol can also function as a guardian. A being can represent a god without being identical to the god. This is not confusion. It is how ancient symbolic systems often behave. They overlap. They remain flexible. They do not stop to ask whether a modern reference book will find them tidy. The Mushkhushshu seems to have worked as a sacred animal associated with divine power, especially the power of Marduk. That already puts it in a high position. Sacred animals are not decorative extras. They are extensions of a god's authority into visible form. They help the god become legible in the world. You may not be able to see Marduk directly, but you can see his beast. You can see it on walls, gates, and monuments. You can pass beneath its image. You can be reminded physically and repeatedly that the city belongs to powers beyond human scale. This is also where the creature becomes more than a religious idea. It becomes political. When a king builds with the symbols of a great god, he is not just showing piety. He is aligning himself with divine order. He is saying that his rule fits the structure of the world as the gods intend it. The Mushkhushshu, placed in royal context, helps tell that story. It says that dangerous force is on the side of the throne. It says that what is frightening has been brought into service. It says that the city is not protected merely by soldiers and walls, but by the symbolic force of heaven's own order. That may sound lofty, but the effect is practical. Ancient people lived in a world of warfare, flood, drought, disease, political collapse, and uncertain survival. A city that could present itself as divinely ordered was not just making an artistic choice. It was addressing fear. Symbols mattered because fear mattered. If a city gate could tell you that the god stood behind the state, that was not abstract decoration. That was reassurance mixed with warning. Reassurance for those inside, warning for those outside. One reason the Mushkhushshu keeps such a firm grip on modern imagination is that it is not entirely easy to domesticate in the mind. The lion becomes familiar quickly. The bull becomes familiar quickly. The dragon beast does not. It stays a little foreign even after you have looked at it for a while. That is useful because it lets us feel something close to what an ancient viewer may have felt. Not the full meaning, of course. We do not share that world. But we can still experience the slight resistance the image creates. It refuses to become ordinary. That refusal is part of its success. A sacred creature should not collapse into mere background. It should remain charged. The Mushkhushshu manages that better than many mythic animals because its form is so exact and yet so alien. It feels official, but not tame. It feels designed, but not harmless. It stands at the edge of comprehension in exactly the way powerful religious symbols often do. There is something else worth noticing. The creature does not need a long surviving narrative cycle of heroic dragon combat in order to matter. It matters because it is embedded in place. Sometimes modern audiences think mythic importance depends on having a big dramatic story attached to it. But sacred imagery can be just as powerful when it is stable, repeated, and public. The Mushkhushshu becomes important not because it dominates surviving adventure tales, but because it stands where power wanted to be seen. That is enough. In some ways, it is more than enough. So when we ask, what is the Mushkhushshu? The best answer is this. It is the serpent dragon of Mesopotamia, a composite sacred beast tied above all to Babylon and the god Marduk, though with older roots that likely reach further back into earlier religious traditions. It is not just a monster, not just a symbol, and not just a decorative animal. It is a creature that helped ancient people picture divine authority in visible form. Its body gathered meanings from several powerful animals. Its horns linked it to the sacred realm. Its presence on major monuments made it part of the official image of empire. It stood at the meeting point of religion, politics, art, and fear. And once you see it that way, the creature stops looking like a strange footnote from an ancient ruin and starts looking like exactly what it was meant to be, a serious piece of Mesopotamian thought in animal form. It tells you how that world imagined power. It tells you that the divine could be unsettling without being evil. It tells you that order was not always pictured as soft, calm, or friendly. Sometimes order wore scales, talons, and a horned head, and stood on a gate to remind everyone entering the city that Babylon was not just brick and dust and administration. It was a place under the eyes of the gods. That raises the next question naturally, because a creature this defined and this important does not simply appear out of nowhere on the walls of Imperial Babylon. Before it became the dragon most people connect with Marduk and the Ishtar Gate, it had to come from somewhere. Older cities, older gods, older layers of belief are waiting behind it. And that is where the trail starts to get even more interesting. Long before the glazed bricks of Babylon carried the image of the Mushkhushshu in neat, repeating lines, long before Marduk stood at the centre of Imperial theology, with a dragon at his side, the ancient Near East was already comfortable with the idea that divine power might appear through strange animals. That is the first thing to keep in mind as we go backward. The Mushkhushshu did not emerge from an empty room. It came from a much older habit of thought, one that had been developing for centuries in the cities, temples, and religious imagination of Mesopotamia. By the time Babylon made the creature famous, the ground had already been prepared by older gods, older symbols, and older ways of picturing the dangerous edge of divine authority. Mesopotamian civilization did not begin with Babylon. That can sound obvious, but it matters here because Babylon often grows so large in later memory that it starts to swallow everything before it. In reality, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates had already seen long ages of city building, temple ritual, kingship, and myth, before Babylon became the centre of the story. Sumerian cities had risen and developed their own sacred worlds. Akkadian rulers had built empires. Local gods had deep roots in individual cities. Religious traditions overlapped, merged, and shifted. Symbols moved between places. A powerful beast associated with one divine figure in one era could later be adopted, reinterpreted, and attached to another god in another era. That is the world in which the earliest echoes of the Mushkhushshu begin to make sense. When people speak about the Anunnaki world in a historical sense, the phrase should not be reduced to one neat system. The divine world of Mesopotamia was layered and crowded. There were the great gods of sky, storm, wisdom, love, war, kingship, the underworld, and the waters beneath the earth. There were city gods with local loyalties. There were divine assemblies. There were protective beings, demons, monsters, sacred animals, and hybrid figures that stood between categories modern readers like to keep separate. The Anunnaki in ancient texts belonged to this larger divine order. They were not alone at the top of some simple pyramid. They were part of a living and changing world of gods, where older traditions were rarely erased completely. They were absorbed, reshaped, or placed into new arrangements. That is why the earliest history of the Mushkhushshu is not a straight line. It is more like following a trail through old temple rooms where names have changed, walls have been rebuilt, and a creature keeps reappearing just enough to show that it was never invented only for one famous moment. Scholars generally connect earlier forms of the dragon beast to gods such as Ninazu and Tishbak before its later and more famous association with Marduk. Those earlier links matter a great deal because they show that the serpent dragon belongs to older Mesopotamian religious layers, not merely to Neo-Babylonian spectacle. Ninazu is one of those gods who immediately reminds modern readers that Mesopotamian religion cannot be forced into tidy, beginner-friendly categories for very long. He is often connected with the underworld, with healing, and with serpentine symbolism. That combination already tells us we're in an old part of the religious landscape. In many ancient cultures, snakes live close to the border between danger and power. They are feared, but also respected. They shed their skins, disappear into cracks in the earth, emerge from hidden places and move with a kind of confidence that suggests they know something everyone else has missed. In Mesopotamia, serpent symbolism could carry associations with the earth, with hidden forces, with protection, and with divine danger. A god like Ninazu, connected to those older and deeper layers, is exactly the kind of deity around whom a dragon-like sacred beast could gather. The association between Ninazu and a serpent dragon does not mean that the Mushkhushshu was already fixed in its later Babylonian form from the very beginning. Ancient symbols rarely stay that stable over very long periods. What it suggests instead is continuity of type. The idea of a divine serpent beast, a powerful reptilian or dragon-like form attached to sacred authority, was already alive before Babylon made it famous. That older association gives the creature depth. It means that when later Babylonians looked at the Mushkhushshu, they were not simply inventing a divine dragon because dragons look impressive on architecture. They were inheriting and reworking something older. Then there is Tishbak, another important figure in this story. Tishbak became associated with the city of Eshnunna and appears to have taken on roles that connected him with power, kingship, and a dragon-like creature. In some traditions, he seems to inherit or absorb functions from earlier divine forms, which is exactly the sort of religious movement Mesopotamian history is full of. Gods rose with cities rose with kings. As power shifted, divine roles could shift with it. A local or regional deity could gain prestige by absorbing older sacred material, including symbols, myths, and associated creatures. So when we find the serpent dragon linked with Tishpak, we're not looking at a random side note. We are seeing another stage in the life of a symbol that was already moving through the religious bloodstream of Mesopotamia. This matters because it helps explain why the Mushkhushshu later fit so naturally beside Marduk. Marduk's rise did not happen in a vacuum either. As Babylon became more powerful, its god became more powerful. One of the ways that happened was through theological expansion. Marduk increasingly gathered titles, functions, and prestige that had once belonged to other gods, or had been distributed more broadly across the divine order. The rise of a supreme city often produces a rise in its supreme god. When that happens, older religious material does not disappear, it gets reorganized around the new center. The Mushkhushshu, with its older background and divine associations, was exactly the kind of symbol that could be drawn into Marduk's orbit, and made to serve Babylon's claim to central importance. So when we look for the oldest echoes of the Mushkhushshu, we are really looking for the earlier life of a sacred serpent dragon in the world of Mesopotamian gods. The creature may not always appear under one perfectly fixed name in every period, and its exact form may not always be identical, but the type is there. That is the important part. There is an old memory in Mesopotamian religion of a divine beast that combines serpentine force with sacred authority. Babylon later sharpened, displayed, and standardized that image in a way the world could not forget, but the roots stretch back into earlier soil. The older Mesopotamian world was especially fertile ground for this kind of creature, because it did not separate cosmic order from dangerous force in the way many modern readers expect. The divine realm was not presented as safe in a soft domestic sense. Gods could bless, but they could also overwhelm. They ruled floods, storms, drought, plague, fertility, war, and kingship. Even protection could come in a frightening form. A guardian did not have to look pleasant. In fact, looking dangerous was often the point. If a creature was going to stand at the edge of sacred space, defend a temple, or symbolize divine command, it made perfect sense for it to wear the features of power taken from the strongest and most unsettling parts of the natural world. That is one reason hybrid and composite beings became so common in Mesopotamian art and thought. They were not mistakes or fantasies in the childish sense. They were visual solutions to a religious problem. How do you picture power that is more than human and more than animal? One answer is to combine the strongest qualities of several beings into one form. A lion alone is powerful, but a lion combined with other traits can become something even more charged. A serpent alone is dangerous, but joined with sacred markings and predatory strength, it becomes part of a different language. The Mushkhushshu belongs to that language, and the oldest echoes of it rise from a time when that way of thinking was already well established. It also helps to remember that Mesopotamian people lived in a world where the boundary between the seen and unseen was not thought to be sealed shut. Dreams mattered, omens mattered, sacred images mattered. The behavior of animals could matter. The arrangement of stars could matter. Ritual actions mattered. A creature did not have to roam the countryside like an ordinary predator in order to be real within that system. If it belonged to the divine order, if it appeared in art, ritual, myth, or temple imagery, then it had a place in the world as Mesopotamians understood it. The Mushkhushshu did not need a zookeeper. It needed religious meaning, and that it had in abundance. This is where the older serpent beast becomes especially interesting in relation to underworld and earth symbolism. A long-bodied, snake-like creature tied to older gods such as Ninazu suggests connections not just to abstract divine power, but to powers associated with the ground, hidden places, and the deeper structure of the world. In Mesopotamian thought, the earth was not just dirt underfoot. It contained the dead. It hid waters. It held temples on its surface and mysteries beneath it. Serpentine beings could therefore carry a sense of ancientness and proximity to those unseen depths. Even when later Babylonian imagery placed the Mushkhushshu in the bright public setting of city gates and imperial display, the creature may still have carried some memory of that older depth. That gives it more weight than a simple ornamental dragon would ever have. There is another useful detail in the way these traditions move. The ancient Near East was not a world of perfect religious borders. Cities traded, fought, borrowed, copied and reinterpreted constantly. Sumerian material passed into Akkadian contexts. Old local cults were brought into wider political systems. Deities could be identified with one another or partially merged. Titles travelled, symbols travelled, artistic forms travelled. That means the early history of the Mushkhushshu is best understood as part of a broad cultural exchange inside Mesopotamia, not as the property of one city from the very start. The creature becomes clearer the more we allow it to move through that older network, and once it moves, it gathers status. A beast that remains local stays local. A beast that can be adopted by rising divine powers gains a wider future. By the time Babylon places the Mushkhushshu in its most visible setting, the creature has already proven itself usable within several levels of Mesopotamian religion. It can serve gods tied to older traditions. It can stand in the company of major city cults. It can be lifted into imperial imagery. That kind of flexibility is one of the reasons it survives so strongly in the record. It was never trapped in one narrow role. It is also worth pausing over the fact that the older Mesopotamian world already had a deep interest in combat myths, monsters, and the taming of dangerous forces. The most famous example is the struggle between Marduk and Tiamat in the Babylonian creation epic, where cosmic order emerges through divine victory over a chaotic, watery enemy. Even though the Mushkhushshu is not simply Tiamat's creature copied onto a wall, it belongs to a wider world where serpentine and monstrous forms already carried strong meanings about danger, power, and divine control. Mesopotamian religion did not fear the monster only as an enemy. It also understood that divine kingship involved mastering the monstrous. A god great enough to rule was a god who could command, defeat, or absorb dangerous power. A sacred dragon beside such a god is therefore not surprising at all. It fits the logic perfectly. That older logic may be one reason later Babylon found the serpent dragon so effective as a symbol of Marduk. If Marduk is the god who establishes order, who rises above rivals, who becomes the centre of Babylon's religious and political identity, then a powerful dragon beast attached to him says several things at once. It says he rules fear. It says he commands what others might dread. It says that the strange and dangerous has been placed under the authority of the supreme god. Those meanings would have been even richer if the creature already carried older sacred associations. In that case, Babylon was not just inventing a symbol for Marduk. It was claiming an inherited sacred force and placing it beneath his name. When modern audiences hear before Babylon rose, it is tempting to picture a blank age of fog and uncertainty, with only a few scattered clues. In reality, there was a great deal of civilization before Babylon's brightest moment. There were temples, scribes, seals, myths, offerings, and long memories stored in cult practice and artistic tradition. Symbols did not need to be explained from scratch each time. They could persist quietly across generations, changing shape without losing their core force. The serpent beast that later became famous as the Mushkhushshu seems to have done exactly that. It endured through religious shifts because it continued to answer a useful need. It gave visible form to divine power that was old, dangerous, protective, and legitimate all at once. There is even something revealing in the fact that the creature did not become famous first through a surviving long epic focused only on its own story. Its importance is structural rather than theatrical. It is built into the sacred world rather than standing outside it as a one-time enemy. That may reflect its older roots. A creature that begins as part of divine symbolism can continue across centuries more easily than a creature attached only to one tale. Tales can fade. Symbols tied to gods and cult practice tend to last longer. The Mushkhushshu feels ancient because it was part of the framework, not just part of the entertainment. All of this gives the creature a more serious kind of age. It is not ancient only because the bricks are old. It is ancient because the idea behind it belongs to a very old Mesopotamian habit of seeing sacred power through composite beings, serpent imagery, divine animals, and transferred symbols. By the time Babylon made the Mushkhushshu famous, the creature was already carrying memory from older cities and older divine relationships. It had stood beside gods before it stood beside empire. That is why the early echoes matter so much. They keep us from mistaking the Babylonian dragon for a single invention of one royal moment. They show us continuity beneath the spectacle. They reveal the old layers beneath the polished public image. The Mushkhushshu was already old when Babylon made it beautiful. It was already sacred when Babylon made it visible on a grand scale. It had already lived beside gods before it began marching across the city's blue walls, and once a symbol carries that much age behind it, the next thing to notice is the body itself. The older echoes tell us where the creature comes from in broad religious terms, but they do not yet explain why it looked the way it did. For that, we have to slow down and examine the animal piece by piece, because every scale, claw, and horn seems to have been chosen for a reason. One of the reasons the Mushkhushshu stays in the mind so easily is that it never lets the eye settle into comfort. Even after you have looked at it several times, even after you know what it is called and which god it belongs to, there is still a small delay in the brain as it tries to make peace with the body. The neck says serpent, the forelegs say lion, the hind legs say bird, the scales say reptile, the horn says divinity. The whole creature says that ordinary categories are not going to be much help here. It is not messy, and it is not vague. In fact, the exact opposite is true. The Mushkhushshu is so clearly designed, so consistent in its major features, that the strangeness feels deliberate in every part. It looks unlike any other creature, because it was built to do more than any one creature could do on its own. That point matters more than it first seems to. Ancient Mesopotamian artists were perfectly capable of depicting real animals. They knew what lions looked like. They knew bulls, birds, snakes, dogs, goats, donkeys, and all the ordinary beasts of field, marsh, desert, and stable. When they created a composite being, they were not failing at realism. They were leaving realism behind on purpose. They were entering a symbolic mode in which the body of a creature became a way to assemble power. The Mushkhushshu is one of the clearest examples of that habit. Nothing about it suggests an artist who could not make up his mind. Everything about it suggests an artist who knew exactly how to combine the right signals. Start with the scales, because scales do a great deal of work before the rest of the body has even been processed. Scales push the creature away from the warm-blooded world most humans are instinctively comfortable with. Fur is familiar. Fur can be dangerous, of course, but it belongs to a system the mind already understands. Scales feel older. They feel more distant. They suggest coldness, endurance, armour, and something that does not especially care whether the human race finds it approachable. In Mesopotamian visual language, a scaled body on a sacred beast carries an immediate sense of otherness. This is not a domestic guardian sitting politely beside the door like a very committed house pet. This is a being with a harder surface, and that harder surface matters. Scales also create a connection to serpents, and serpents in the ancient Near East already carried heavy symbolic weight. A snake can disappear into cracks in the ground, emerge without warning, strike quickly, and move in a way that looks unnaturally smooth compared with hoofed or pawed animals. It belongs to the earth in a different manner than most creatures do. It seems close to hidden places. It sheds its skin and appears renewed. It can be feared, respected, cursed, admired, and watched with a kind of unwilling fascination. Ancient peoples noticed all of that. They did not need a modern symbolic handbook to tell them that snakes felt important. So when the Mushkhushshu takes on a scaled body and a serpentine line, it borrows that entire atmosphere. It becomes something ancient, watchful, and difficult to place safely within ordinary life. At the same time, the creature does not remain a snake. If it were only a serpent, it would already be powerful. but it would be missing the broader field of meanings the final form carries. That is where the legs matter. The front legs are usually those of a lion or another large predatory cat. This is a brilliant choice because the lion was already one of the strongest visual signals of power in the ancient world. A lion is not merely a strong animal, it is royal force in fur. It suggests dominance, hunting skill, control, and a level of physical confidence most creatures can only regret from a distance. When the Mushkhushshu stands on lion-like forelegs, it gains the stance of terrestrial authority. It is no longer only the long-body danger of a serpent. It now has the grounding of a land predator that can hold space. There is something psychologically effective about placing lion legs at the front. The front of the body is where the creature meets you. It is where you read intention. A serpent body might glide or coil, but lion forelegs plant the beast in the world with visible strength. They tell you that this creature is not only strange, it is formidable. It can advance, it can brace, it can claim ground. That is important for a symbol used in sacred and royal contexts. A being associated with divine authority should not look flimsy. It should look like it belongs exactly where it stands, and like removing it would be a poor decision. Then the hind legs change the whole mood again. Instead of matching the front with another pair of feline limbs, the Mushkhushshu often ends in bird-like legs with talons. That shift matters because bird legs bring a different kind of force. Lions dominate by weight and muscle. Birds of prey dominate by precision, speed, and sharpness. Talons are tools of seizure. They grip, tear, and hold. They introduce an aerial logic into a creature otherwise tied to the ground and to serpentine movement. The result is a body that no longer belongs to one realm. It takes something from the earth, something from the hunter, and something from the predator of the sky. That gives the creature range. It becomes a beast assembled from several domains at once. This kind of composite construction is exactly why the Mushkhushshu does not look like an ordinary monster. Many monsters in mythology are defined by excess. More heads, more teeth, more chaos, more limbs than any sane person ordered. The Mushkhushshu is not excessive in that way. It is selective. It chooses only what is needed. Long body, scales, strong forequarters, taloned rear, horned head. Each feature is doing a job. That makes the creature feel controlled, and that sense of control is one of the main reasons it works so well as a symbol of divine authority. It is not wild invention for its own sake. It is disciplined invention. The head deserves special attention because it carries both identity and status. The long snout and reptilian or serpent-like shape maintain the scaled, dragon-like line of the body, but the horn changes the meaning. In Mesopotamian art, horns are serious business. Horned crowns belong to gods. Horns can mark divinity, sacred power, or a being's participation in the realm above ordinary creatures. So when the Mushkhushshu bears a horned head, it is not just becoming more decorative, it is being marked as a creature of divine association. That small upward projection on the head is doing the work of theology. This is one of the easiest details to miss if you look at the creature casually. The scales and the claws attract attention right away because they feel dramatic. The horn can seem minor by comparison, but symbolically, it may be one of the most important features of all. A lion with a horn is no longer just a lion. A serpent with a horn is no longer just a serpent. The horn tells the viewer that the beast belongs near gods, temples, and sacred kingship. It does not have to be a god itself for that sign to matter. It is enough that it bears the visual language of divine proximity. The neck, long and slightly curved, is another clever piece of the design. It gives the Mushkhushshu a posture unlike the lowered menace of a stalking cat or the coiling tension of a snake about to strike. Instead, the creature seems to carry itself upward and forward in a way that feels alert and supervisory. It looks like it is inspecting the world. It looks less like an animal reacting to instinct and more like a being that occupies a station. That suits a sacred emblem perfectly. A creature on a gate or temple wall should not look like it wandered in by accident while looking for lunch. It should look aware of its own role. The tale continues that controlled line. Rather than ending in a heavy mass or disappearing without significance, it carries the serpentine quality through the back of the body and reinforces continuity. The whole creature stays long, lean and unified even while combining several kinds of anatomy. That unity is one of the most impressive things about the design. Composite creatures can easily become clumsy. The Mushkhushshu avoids that by preserving a consistent flow through the body. It is made of different parts, but it still feels like one creature rather than a pile of spare animal pieces assembled by a very strange carpenter. It also helps to compare the Mushkhushshu with other composite beings from Mesopotamia to see why it stands apart. The Lamasu, for example, combine human, bull and bird elements, but they do so in a way that emphasizes monumental guardianship and intelligence. They have a broad architectural presence. The Mushkhushshu is different. It is narrower, more sinuous, more reptilian, more unsettling. It lacks the almost civic dignity of the Lamasu, and instead carries a colder intensity. It feels closer to the category of sacred beast than guardian personage. It is less like a supernatural official and more like a divine animal that has been refined into symbol. Compared to ordinary serpents, it is too structured and elevated. Compared to lions, it is too alien. Compared to bulls, it is too lean. Compared to birds of prey, it is too grounded in scales and reptilian line. That is exactly why it remains memorable. Every familiar comparison fails just enough to keep the creature alive in the imagination. You can never reduce it fully to one source animal and move on. There is also a practical visual reason why this form worked so well in art, especially in repeated architectural programs like the Ishtar gate. The long body creates a strong profile. The legs break the line at useful points. The horned head gives a recognizable silhouette. The contrast between feline forelegs and avian hind legs keeps the eye interested. On glazed brick, where form has to read clearly from a distance and in repetition, the Mushkhushshu is ideal. It is distinctive enough that no one mistakes it for the wrong creature, but orderly enough that it can be repeated across a wall without losing coherence. In other words, the form is not only symbolic, it is excellent design. Ancient artists understood silhouette more than modern people sometimes credit them for. A sacred or royal animal placed on a public monument must be legible. It must hold shape at a distance. It must repeat well. The Mushkhushshu does all of that. Its long neck and tail form elegant curves. Its body remains compact enough to read as a single unit. Its unusual legs make it unmistakable. Even in simplified forms, it stays itself. That is one reason it could become iconic. A badly designed composite creature disappears into confusion. This one announces itself immediately. The combination of features also solves a deeper symbolic problem. If the creature had been too serpentine, it might have leaned too heavily into chthonic or underworld associations, becoming a sign of hidden menace without enough royal clarity. If it had been too leonine, it might have looked powerful but too familiar, not strange enough to express the divine beyond ordinary kingship. If it had been too bird-like, it could have lost the grounded weight needed for architectural and political use. By combining all three, the Mushkhushshu reaches a middle ground that is not really a middle ground at all. It becomes a total creature, drawing power from land, sky, and the deep places associated with serpents and scaled beings. This helps explain why it could serve not just as a monster or mythic curiosity, but as an emblem of command. A divine beast should not represent only one type of force. The god it serves rules broadly. The state that displays it claims broad order. The creature therefore needs to feel larger than a single natural category. It must seem able to move between worlds, or at least to gather them into itself. That is exactly what the Mushkhushshu does. It does not merely resemble a dragon. It behaves like a summary of several dangerous natural truths, rearranged into sacred service. There is even a kind of emotional strategy in the creature's appearance. A lion can be admired, a snake can be feared, a bird of prey can be respected. The mushkushu combines those reactions without allowing the viewer the comfort of recognizing a familiar animal all the way through. It keeps admiration, fear, and respect active at once. That mixed reaction is extremely useful for religious and political imagery. The gods should inspire reverence. The city should inspire awe. The king should be connected with powers that exceed common life. A beast that produces several responses at once is doing exactly what it should. This may also be why the creature has been so tempting for modern speculative theories. People look at it and sense intention so strongly that they want an equally strong explanation. A random fantasy doodle would never create the same effect. The Mushkhushshu feels purposeful, almost coded. That invites grand claims. Perhaps it was remembered from life. Perhaps it was copied from a lost creature. Perhaps it preserves some buried ancient encounter. Those ideas say more about how compelling the design is than about whether the claims are true. The creature simply looks as though it means something important, and in the Mesopotamian context it absolutely did. Still, the best explanation remains the strongest one. It looked unlike any other creature because it was built to occupy a unique place in the symbolic world of Mesopotamia. It needed the old danger of the serpent, the sovereign strength of the lion, the sharp predatory force of the bird, and the sacred marking of the horn. It needed to feel ancient without being vague, divine without being identical to a god, and dangerous without being uncontrolled. It needed to stand on city walls and temple imagery as a being that could express divine power in visible form. That is not a small assignment. A normal animal would not have been enough. Once you see the creature that way, its body becomes easier to read. The scales are not just reptile skin. They are armour, antiquity, and distance from ordinary life. The horn is not just decoration. It is sacred status. The claws are not just weapons. They are the grasp of a power that can seize and hold. The lion forelegs announce strength and command over the ground. The bird hind legs add sharpness and reach from another realm of predation. The long neck and tail hold the whole thing together in one continuous, unnerving line. Every part says that this beast belongs where divine authority meets human fear. It is worth remembering too that Mesopotamian religion did not reward softness in sacred imagery simply for being soft. Protection could look severe. Order could look intimidating. A city that wished to declare itself under divine rule did not need its symbols to smile politely. It needed them to convince. The Mushkhushshu convinces by looking as though it could not possibly belong to an ordinary human world, and yet has chosen to stand within one. That is a very effective visual statement. It tells the viewer that higher powers are present, and that those powers do not depend on human comfort. In the end, the creature looked unlike any other, because it was doing the work of several creatures, several symbolic traditions, and several levels of meaning all at once. It stood at the edge of temple thought, royal ideology, and deep older serpent imagery. It was designed to be unmistakable. It was designed to remain slightly foreign. It was designed to carry the presence of the divine without collapsing into a mere illustration. That is why the image lasts. It was never casual, and the closer you look at the body, the more naturally one detail begins to pull the whole story toward its next stage, because a creature this carefully assembled was not left wandering free in the religious imagination for long. Eventually it came to belong above all to one god, and once that happened, the dragon was no longer just an old sacred beast from the wider Mesopotamian world. It became the creature of Marduk. By the time most people meet the Mushkhushshu, it is already standing beside Marduk. That is the version that lasted. That is the version Babylon showed the world. That is the version burned into blue glazed brick, carried through museums, textbooks, documentaries, and every modern conversation that tries to explain why one of the oldest great cities on Earth decided to decorate itself with a long-necked dragon that looked as though several highly opinionated animals had been asked to share one body. But the real question is not only what the creature looked like. The real question is how it came to belong to Marduk so completely that later memory almost treats the two as if they had always been together. The short answer is that gods rise with cities and symbols rise with gods. The longer answer is much more interesting, because it tells us how Mesopotamian religion actually worked. The old world between the rivers was never frozen in place. Gods did not remain neatly sorted in separate boxes for thousands of years, while everyone politely agreed on the same meanings forever. Cities gained power and lost it. Kings conquered and were conquered. Priests preserved old traditions but also adapted them. Myths were copied, expanded, rearranged and interpreted. Divine roles shifted. Symbols moved from one context to another. A creature that once belonged to an older sacred world could be drawn into a new religious centre and emerge more famous than ever. That is exactly the kind of world in which the Mushkhushshu became the dragon of Marduk. To understand why that happened, it helps to understand who Marduk became. There was a time when Marduk was not yet the towering figure he would later become in Babylonian religion. Like many Mesopotamian gods, he began as the patron deity of a particular city. In this case, that city was Babylon. At first, Babylon was not the unquestioned centre of the universe, at least not to everyone else. Mesopotamia was full of old and proud cities, each with its own god, traditions, temple networks, and reasons for thinking it mattered very much. But history has a way of rearranging religious importance when political importance changes. As Babylon rose, Marduk rose with it. This was not just a matter of local enthusiasm. It was theology following power, and power feeding theology in return. When Babylon became more influential, its god became harder to ignore. Once kings ruled in Babylon's name, once empires formed around Babylonian prestige, once scribes wrote and copied texts under its influence, Marduk's place in the divine order began to expand. He was no longer merely the god of one city among many. He became a god whose status needed to reflect the city's claim to central importance. That meant older divine functions, older symbols and older stories could begin to gather around him. This is where the Mushkhushshu enters the picture in a more decisive way. The creature did not simply appear one morning because someone in a Babylonian workshop thought Marduk needed a better mascot. Ancient sacred animals do not work like sports logos. They come with history. As we have already seen, the serpent dragon type seems to reach back into earlier associations, including links with gods like Ninazu and Tishpak. That matters because it means Marduk's relationship with the creature was probably part of a larger process of religious inheritance and reassignment. The dragon did not become his because it was invented for him alone. It became his because Marduk became the sort of god who could absorb older sacred power into his own orbit. That process would have made perfect sense in Mesopotamian religion. When a god rose in status, he did not always become greater by discarding older traditions. He became greater by gathering them. Titles that once belonged elsewhere could be attributed to him. Powers once spread across several divine figures could be concentrated in him. Myths could be retold in ways that placed him nearer the centre. Symbols attached to earlier sacred authority could be reassigned or newly emphasized under his name. So when the Mushkhushshu came into the company of Marduk, it was not only a decorative choice, it was a statement that this god now stood in possession of an older, potent, and already meaningful symbol. That is one reason the pairing works so well. Marduk was not a quiet household deity associated with mild weather and sensible scheduling. He was a god of kingship, order, authority, and cosmic importance in the Babylonian system. In the great Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, Marduk becomes the champion who defeats Tiamat, the great chaotic sea power, and then orders the cosmos. That story is one of the clearest signs of his rise. It does not merely praise him, it places him at the centre of creation, rule, and divine legitimacy. A god who defeats chaos and establishes order is exactly the sort of god who should stand beside a dragon-like beast that looks dangerous, but controlled. That controlled danger is the key. The Mushkhushshu is not simply frightening, it is frightening in service of authority. That is why it fits Marduk so well. Marduk is not chaos itself. He is the ruler who masters chaos, redirects dangerous force, and turns victory into stable order. A creature like the Mushkhushshu visually expresses that kind of power. It says that the god does not merely sit above the world in abstract dignity. He commands what others fear. He has dangerous things on his side. He's not threatened by the strange. The strange serves him. This is a very old and very effective religious idea. A powerful god often proves his power not by avoiding danger but by ruling over it. Storm gods command the storm rather than hiding from it. War gods direct violence rather than pretending violence does not exist. Kings present themselves as protectors by showing they can wield force. In that sense, the Mushkhushshu does for Marduk what the lion did for other rulers and gods, but in a more specialised way. The lion is familiar power. The Mushkhushshu is sacred power made strange and therefore larger. It suggests that Marduk's authority reaches beyond the ordinary natural world into a level where categories bend to divine command. There is also a political elegance to the pairing. Babylon needed symbols that were strong enough to support big claims. It was not enough for the city to say it was important. Cities always say that. It needed to present itself as the place where divine rule was properly anchored. It needed a god who could stand above rivals. It needed public imagery that could make those claims feel natural. The Mushkhushshu helped do that because it was both ancient in feeling and visually distinctive. It looked like inherited sacred force, not a fresh public relations experiment. By associating it so strongly with Marduk, Babylon could claim continuity with older divine traditions, while also presenting Marduk as the god now fully entitled to them. That is one of the quiet strengths of Mesopotamian religion as a political instrument. It did not always throw away the past when reorganizing power. It absorbed the past. If an older symbol had authority, then the most successful thing to do was not to banish it, but to place it under a new divine master. That is much more convincing. It says the new order does not begin from nothing. It fulfills what came before. The Mushkhushshu, with its older serpent beast background, was perfect for this kind of religious consolidation. Under Marduk it becomes not just old power, but old power now properly aligned with Babylon's god. There is another reason the beast became Marduk's companion so effectively. Marduk's character in the Babylonian imagination was broad enough to support a rich symbolic environment. He was associated not only with rule and cosmic order, but also with wisdom, judgment, and the structured life of the city. Babylonian kings did not rule as independent freelancers with crowns. They ruled under divine sanction. The city, the temple, the court, the walls, the ceremonies, the festival routes, the inscriptions, and the monuments all work together to make rule look like a reflection of divine arrangement. In that system, a sacred beast tied to Marduk helped make divine presence visible. You might not see the god directly, but you could see his creature on the walls and know whose order governed the place. This relationship between god and beast should not be reduced to the modern idea of a pet. The Mushkhushshu is not Marduk's pet dragon, in the sense that a fantasy king keeps an impressive animal nearby because it looks good in portraits. That would flatten the meaning too much. Sacred animals in the ancient Near East were extensions of divine identity, visible signs of a god's nature, authority, or sphere of command. They were associated presences. They helped communicate what kind of power a god held. So when the Mushkhushshu becomes Marduk's creature, it is not simply accompanying him like a loyal hound with scales. It is representing something true about him, as Babylon understood him. It is the visual form of controlled sacred threat attached to legitimate divine kingship. This is where the creature's body starts to matter again in a new way. The lion-like forelegs carry royal strength. The serpent body carries ancient, dangerous force. The bird-like hind legs add sharpness and an almost unnatural reach. The horn marks sacred association. When these qualities are placed beside Marduk, the whole beast starts to read like a summary of divine rule over different kinds of power. Land, hidden depths, predation, sacred command, all assembled into one animal under one god. It is hard to imagine a more effective emblem for a deity whose prestige was meant to grow until it overshadowed nearly everyone else around him. And that overshadowing did happen. Marduk's rise was not only local devotion, it was intellectual, liturgical, and imperial. Texts gave him greater status. Priestly traditions elevated him. Royal building programs honoured him. The famous New Year festival in Babylon involved ceremonies that reinforced his central place. In such a setting, symbols associated with him gained tremendous public force. Once the Mushkhushshu entered that field, its fate changed permanently. It was no longer one sacred beast among others. It became part of the visual language of one of the most powerful religious centres in the ancient world. That kind of association has a habit of rewriting memory. Later generations often remember the most successful version of a symbol and let the earlier versions fade into the background. That is why many people now encounter the Mushkhushshu almost entirely through Marduk and Babylon. The earlier ties are still there for those who go looking, but Babylon's presentation was so effective that it became the dominant memory. This is not unusual. Powerful empires are very good at deciding which version of a symbol survives. If they put it on gates, walls, and monuments, then that is the version history tends to keep. It is also worth noticing that Marduk did not need a soft symbol. A god who defeats Tiamat and orders the cosmos should not be followed around by something that looks like it might politely apologize for taking up too much space. He needed a beast with presence. He needed a creature that would feel ancient enough to command respect and strange enough to suggest a level of power beyond human normality. The Mushkhushshu does both. It is not a lion, because a lion is too familiar. It is not a snake, because a snake is too narrow in meaning. It is not a bird, because that would shift the symbolism too far upward. It is the right mixture for a god whose authority is total enough to gather many forms of power without becoming identical to any single one. There may also be something deeper in the pairing of Marduk and the dragon beast if we think about the old Mesopotamian habit of turning cosmic victory into public order. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk does not merely win a fight. He builds order out of triumph. He creates structure after conflict. That pattern matters because it mirrors what kings claim to do politically. They defeat enemies, establish order, build cities, maintain walls, and present peace as something won by force and preserved by legitimacy. The Mushkhushshu reflects that same logic. It is danger made obedient to order. It is threat incorporated into law. It is the image of power no longer loose, but placed where it can serve. That helps explain why the creature could be public without being embarrassing. Some mythic monsters are too chaotic to place at the front door of empire unless the point is to show them being crushed. The Mushkhushshu is different. It can stand on the front door precisely because it has already been brought into the side of divine authority. That makes it ideal for Marduk. It is not merely a defeated enemy. It is a sacred beast now fully aligned with the god who rules Babylon. If you imagine the effect on an ancient viewer, the pairing becomes even clearer. You approach a monumental space in Babylon. You know Marduk's name. You know the city claims divine status and favour. Then you see the Mushkhushshu, not hidden in a private chamber, but displayed as part of the city's public skin. The message is not subtle. Marduk's power is present here. It is old. It is strong. It is not safe to oppose. The creature carries that message without needing a speech. It says it through form alone. This is one reason the phrase, companion of a god, works, as long as we hear it correctly. The Mushkhushshu is Marduk's companion not because it softens him, or provides friendly company in the divine household. It is his companion because it attends his authority. It makes his kind of rule visible. It belongs in his symbolic court. It travels with his image in the architecture of Babylon. It is near him because what it represents is near the core of who he became in Babylonian theology. There is always a temptation to imagine this process as if one king or priest at one moment made a simple decision, and that was that. Ancient religion is usually slower and more layered than that. The dragon became Marduk's through repetition, prestige, theology, political use, and successful public display. Once those forces aligned, the association hardened. The more Babylon celebrated Marduk, the more the creature mattered. The more the creature mattered, the more clearly it signalled Marduk. Over time, the bond became so strong that it looked inevitable, which is often what happens when a symbol wins history. And it did win history. Not perfectly, not in the sense that everyone today knows its name without help, but in the sense that when the modern world rediscovers Babylon, one of the images that comes back most vividly is that dragon. Not because it shouted the loudest in myth, but because it stood exactly where a successful empire needed it to stand. Beside Marduk, the Mushkhushshu became permanent enough to outlive the bricks that first gave it colour. So the beast became the companion of a god through the same forces that shaped so much of Mesopotamian religion: inheritance, adaptation, rising political power, theological expansion, and the need to make invisible authority visible. It had older roots, but Babylon gave it its lasting master. Marduk had many signs of greatness, but few are as visually memorable as this one. Once the dragon stood under his name, it ceased to be merely an old sacred beast moving through the background of Mesopotamian religion. It became the dragon of Babylon's god, and from that point on the next step was almost inevitable, because a creature that powerful was never going to remain only in story and symbolism. Babylon was going to build it into the city itself. By the time the Mushkhushshu reached the Ishtar gate, it had stopped being only an old sacred beast moving through religious memory, and become something larger, something public, something no visitor to Babylon could miss. This is where the dragon stepped out of the world of temple association and divine symbolism and into architecture on a scale that made its meaning impossible to ignore. Once Babylon placed it in brick and blue fire, the creature was no longer just a companion of Marduk in an abstract sense. It became part of the city's body. It lived on the walls. It watched people enter. It turned religion into landscape. That transformation matters because cities in the ancient Near East were never just collections of buildings. They were statements. They were claims made in mud brick, stone, timber, bitumen, and colour. The city told you what kind of order ruled there long before anyone handed you an inscription. Babylon understood that better than almost anyone. By the Neo-Babylonian period, especially under Nebuchadnezzar II, the city was not being built merely for practical life. It was being shaped as a vision of power, legitimacy, and divine favour. The Ishtar Gate was one of the clearest expressions of that vision. When people hear the word gate, they often imagine something fairly modest. Maybe a thick wooden door, maybe a fortified entrance, maybe a practical structure with guards nearby, and a general feeling that unauthorized entry would be unwise. The Ishtar Gate was that in the broad sense, but it was also much more. It was monumental, ceremonial, and deeply intentional. It formed part of the grand northern approach to the inner city, connected to the processional way, and worked not just as a point of entry, but as a carefully designed experience. You were meant to see it. You were meant to feel it. And if Babylon had done its job correctly, you were meant to understand something about the city before you had even crossed the threshold. The first thing that made the gate unforgettable was its colour. That deep, saturated blue of the glazed brick still has the power to stop modern viewers in their tracks, and it must have been even more astonishing in its original setting. Ancient cities were not always the plain beige ruins we inherit after centuries of weathering and collapse. They were often brighter, more finished, and much more visually controlled than people expect. Babylon knew how to use colour as authority. The blue of the Ishtar Gate was not casual. It gave the structure a polished, almost unearthly surface. one that separated it immediately from the ordinary mud brick world around it. Against that vivid background, the relief figures of animals stood out with extraordinary force. That blue matters for the Mushkhushshu because it changes the creature's atmosphere. A dragon in plain brick would still be impressive. A dragon moving across a deep blue field begins to feel almost suspended between architecture and myth. The surface no longer reads like ordinary building material. It starts to feel ceremonial, heightened, closer to the realm of the gods than to the everyday dust of traffic and trade. There is a reason the gate still feels theatrical. It was designed to feel that way. The Babylonians did not spend enormous resources glazing, shaping, firing, transporting, and assembling these bricks because they thought city planning was a nice hobby to pass the time. They did it because appearances mattered, and divine appearances mattered most of all. The animal reliefs on the gate were arranged in repeating lines, and each creature carried divine association. Lions were linked with Ishtar. Bulls, or more accurately the great aurochs-like figures, were associated with Adad. The Mushkhushshu was associated with Marduk. This meant the gate was not just ornamented. It was populated with symbols of major divine powers. The city was showing itself under sacred protection and sacred authority. It was saying, without any need for a speech, that the walls of Babylon did not belong to mere human administration. They belonged to a world backed by gods. This is what makes the presence of the Mushkhushshu so important. The creature was not hidden in some obscure side chamber where only priests and specialists could see it. It was visible on a monumental public structure. That tells us immediately that Babylon wanted the dragon seen. Not tolerated, not quietly included, seen. And once you understand that, the question becomes sharper. Why would a city place such a strange creature so prominently on one of its great ceremonial entrances? Part of the answer is that the gate was functioning as a kind of visual theology. Babylon did not separate religion, kingship, and public architecture into the neat categories modern bureaucracy prefers. The city's grandeur was a religious statement. The king's building works were acts of devotion and legitimacy. The gods were not distant ideas floating above civic life. They were woven into it. So when Nebuchadnezzar built and rebuilt on this scale, he was not simply fortifying the city. He was helping stage Babylon as the chosen centre of divine order. The animals on the gate made that claim visible. The Mushkhushshu fit this purpose especially well because it was more unsettling than the other creatures. A lion is powerful, but familiar. A bull is powerful, but familiar. The Mushkhushshu is powerful and unfamiliar. It catches the eye differently. It slows the viewer down. Even someone who knew exactly what it was would still feel the oddity of its body. The long neck, the horned head, the scales, the forelegs of a predator, the hind legs of a bird. This was not a beast from field or riverbank. It belonged to a different level of the world. That is exactly why it worked on the gate. It made the divine feel present in a form that ordinary life could not fully absorb. Imagine the approach. You are coming along the processional way, which itself was designed to impress, lined with reliefs and built for movement, ceremony and state display. Perhaps it is a festival day. Perhaps the city is crowded. Priests, officials, visitors, merchants, soldiers and subjects all move through the same carefully arranged space. Then the gate rises ahead, blue and massive, carrying rows of sacred animals. The lions already announce force. The bulls announce power and storm authority. Then the Mushkhushshu appears, and now the city is speaking in the language of divine kingship. Marduk is not merely worshipped somewhere inside the walls. His presence is part of the entrance. The city itself becomes his stage. It is worth remembering that the Ishtar Gate was tied to processions, especially the New Year festival, which was one of the most important religious events in Babylonian life. During such ceremonies, the relationship between the city, the gods, the king, and cosmic order was not just discussed, it was enacted. Statues moved, Rituals unfolded, roots mattered, architecture mattered. In that setting, the gate became more than a beautiful structure. It became part of a sacred choreography. Passing through it was not only movement through space, it was movement through a highly charged symbolic environment. The Mushkhushshu, fixed in its place, participated in that environment every time the city performed its own religious meaning. That helps explain why the dragon was made in durable, repeated form. A story told once can be forgotten. A creature built into the walls and seen by generations does not disappear so easily. Brick repeats memory. Glaze preserves prestige. Relief gives the symbol a body that survives beyond the moment of ritual. Babylon was not content with telling people that Marduk mattered. It made Marduk's creature part of what people physically encountered. That is a far stronger way to rule imagination. There is also something deeply practical about using the Mushkhushshu in architecture. Sacred symbols work best when they are attached to movement and thresholds. Gates are important because they separate outside from inside, foreign from protected, approach from arrival. Thresholds are where power needs to make itself most obvious. A city wall says, "There is a boundary." A monumental gate says, "There is a boundary, and it belongs to an order greater than you." The Mushkhushshu standing on that threshold turns the message from political to cosmic. You are not simply crossing into a defended city. You are crossing into a city that claims divine backing. This threshold logic is ancient and widespread. Human beings place symbols of guardianship and authority at entrances, because entrances make people vulnerable. They are points of passage, negotiation, inspection, danger, and display. In Mesopotamia, where protective spirits, hybrid guardians, and sacred beasts were already part of the visual world, putting such a creature on a gate made immediate sense. The Mushkhushshu does not have to leap down and attack anyone for its presence to matter. It matters because it marks the space. It tells you what kind of power governs entry. There is an interesting balance at work here between movement and stillness. The reliefs show the animals in forward motion, and the repeated lines create a sense of procession, of ordered advance. Yet the bricks themselves are fixed. The creatures move and do not move at the same time. This is a clever artistic effect. It gives the wall life without chaos. The animals seem active but permanently disciplined. That fits Babylon's message perfectly. Power is alive, strong and dangerous, but under control. The Mushkhushshu does not rage. It advances in order. That is exactly what a sacred beast of Marduk should do. Nebuchadnezzar II understood the political value of this kind of building extraordinarily well. His inscriptions celebrate his construction works in terms that link kingship, devotion, and enduring magnificence. He wanted Babylon not only to be powerful, but to look inevitable. A city can conquer territory by force, but it conquers memory by image. The Ishtar Gate helped do that, and the Mushkhushshu, as one of its most distinctive creatures, became part of Babylon's claim to permanence. The message was simple enough beneath all the splendour. This city stands under the highest authority, and that authority has been built into the walls. There is a tendency in modern life to treat decoration as secondary, as though a building's real purpose is one thing, and its imagery is only a finishing touch. In Babylon, that distinction does not hold very well. The imagery was part of the function. The gate did not first exist as a neutral military structure, and then get dressed up for style. It was conceived as an object that worked physically, politically, ritually, and symbolically all at once. The dragon reliefs are not optional extras. They are among the reasons the gate means what it means, and they mean more because of the material itself. Glazed brick has a peculiar power. It is manufactured, controlled, and durable in a way that ordinary mud brick is not. It catches light. It resists weather differently. It can hold strong colour and clear form. When the Mushkhushshu appears in glazed brick, it becomes sharper, cleaner, more official. The city has taken an ancient sacred beast and given it a kind of immortal skin. There is something very Babylonian about that. Raw myth becomes finished empire. Old divine force becomes polished state display. The firing process behind those bricks also adds something to the story, even if ancient viewers did not stand around discussing kiln temperatures like enthusiastic modern restorers. Fire changes clay. It hardens it. It fixes colour into permanence. There is almost a symbolic neatness in the fact that Babylon's dragon enters public life through a process of shaping and burning. A creature of sacred danger is turned into orderly relief through royal technology. Earth, water, pigment, fire, design and labour all combine to produce an image of divine authority. Even the making of the gate follows the logic of Mesopotamian kingship. Raw materials gathered, disciplined, transformed, and arranged into order. That labour should not be forgotten. A monumental gate is not just an idea. It is planning, extraction, transport, firing, supervision, skilled work, and vast human effort. The Mushkhushshu on the wall is therefore also a record of organised empire. It tells us that Babylon had the resources and the will to turn sacred imagery into civic reality on a huge scale. The dragon is not only a religious symbol, it is proof of administrative capacity. It shows what happens when a powerful state decides that its theology should be visible from a distance. There is a small irony here that makes the creature even more effective. The Mushkhushshu is a composite beast, assembled from several kinds of natural power. The gate is also a composite achievement, assembled from politics, religion, craft, spectacle and engineering. In a sense, the city and the dragon reflect one another. Both are built things designed to project control. Both turn many elements into one unified statement. Both exist to make power appear natural and complete. If you think about the emotional experience of encountering the gate, the dragon's role becomes clearer still. A city can intimidate through size alone, but size fades if it lacks personality. The Mushkhushshu gives Babylon personality, and not a friendly one. It makes the city seem older, stranger, and more connected to divine force than walls alone could accomplish. It says that Babylon is not merely defended, it is sanctioned. It is not merely inhabited, it is chosen. That kind of atmosphere matters tremendously in a world where legitimacy is always being contested, and where kings need people to believe that rule is more than temporary force. There is also the matter of repetition. One dragon would be memorable. Many dragons become a system. Repetition is one of the oldest tools of authority because it trains the mind. When the same image appears again and again in ordered form, it stops feeling accidental and begins to feel structural. Babylon did not present the Mushkhushshu as a one-time curiosity. It repeated it as part of a disciplined visual language. That repetition tells viewers that the creature is not a story someone once told. It is part of the city's truth about itself. And because it is repeated beside other divine animals, the dragon becomes part of a hierarchy rather than a lone spectacle. The gate is not a wall covered in random powerful creatures, chosen by an enthusiastic committee with very dramatic taste. It is organised. Ishtar, Adad, Marduk, Lion, Bull, Mushkhushshu. Different powers, different associations, all placed in a coherent programme. The city presents itself as aligned with major divine forces, each expressed through the right animal form. The Mushkhushshu is therefore strongest not only because of what it is alone, but because of where it stands among the others. By this point, the beast had achieved something rare. It had become both specific and universal within Babylon's world. Specific because everyone could identify it as the creature of Marduk. Universal because everyone passing the gate would experience its presence whether they were priests, nobles, labourers, visitors, or foreign envoys. It belonged to the highest theology and the broadest public experience at the same time. That is exactly how a symbol becomes unforgettable. All of this is why the Ishtar Gate matters so much in the story of the Mushkhushshu. It was the moment when an old sacred beast, already tied to Marduk, entered monumental public architecture and became part of how Babylon presented itself to the world. It ceased to be merely known and became unavoidable. It moved from religious association into civic display without losing its sacred force. In fact, the move made that force even stronger, because now the dragon was not just attached to divine authority, it was built into the route by which people approached it. And once Babylon had done that, the next question could no longer be postponed. A creature placed so prominently on one of the great ceremonial structures of the ancient world was clearly not there, simply because it looked impressive against blue glaze, though it certainly did. The real issue is what the city believed that creature expressed. Once the dragon was fixed in brick and made to walk forever across the walls, it became impossible to treat it as just a monster. It had become a statement about power itself. Once the Mushkhushshu was walking across the Ishtar gate in bright glazed brick, one thing became impossible to deny. Babylon was not treating this creature as a random monster from an old story. It was not using the image the way a frightened village might paint a beast on a wall simply to remember what it once feared. The city was doing something much more deliberate. It was taking a creature with an unsettling body and placing it inside the official language of power. That means we have to stop thinking of the Mushkhushshu as though it were only a dragon-shaped threat and start looking at what it actually did in the world of the ancient Near East. Because in that world, an image could be frightening and still belong to order. In fact, sometimes the frightening image was the best way to show that order was real. Modern people are often trained by later stories to divide creatures into neat roles. If it looks dangerous, it must be evil. If it is reptilian, horned, or difficult to explain, it probably belongs on the side of chaos. If a hero appears nearby with a weapon, we assume the story is headed toward the usual conclusion. That is not how the ancient Near East always thought. The old civilizations of Mesopotamia, Assyria, Anatolia, and their neighbours did not require power to look gentle in order for it to be legitimate. They did not assume that a sacred image had to be comforting. Quite often the opposite was true. A being that protected a temple, a palace, a gate, or a king might need to look severe, overwhelming, and far outside normal human life. The point was not to make the viewer feel relaxed. The point was to make the viewer understand that higher forces were present. That is where the Mushkhushshu becomes especially useful. It looks strange enough to create distance from ordinary life, and it looks strong enough to belong beside a god. Those two qualities are important. A sacred symbol needs to be set apart. If it looks too ordinary, it loses force. If it looks too chaotic, it cannot be trusted as part of divine order. The Mushkhushshu sits in exactly the right place between those extremes. It is not normal, but it is not shapeless. It is dangerous, but not uncontrolled. It is unsettling, but not confused. That balance makes it ideal for expressing a kind of power that is above the human level, but still aligned with law, kingship, and divine authority. In the ancient Near East, symbols worked hard. They were not decoration in the modern sense, where a building or object can function perfectly well and then receive a little artistic improvement afterward. Symbol and function were often woven together. A palace relief was not merely making a wall more interesting. A guardian figure at a doorway was not simply there because someone thought entrances looked empty. A sacred animal on a gate was not a visual hobby. These things told viewers how to read the space they were entering. They told them who ruled it, what protected it, and what kind of cosmic backing stood behind the human system they were walking into. The Mushkhushshu is best understood inside that world, because once you place it there, it stops being a curious dragon and starts becoming legible. A city like Babylon wanted to be read correctly. That is something cities with large empires always want. They do not just want to exist, they want to shape interpretation. They want visitors, subjects, rivals, and even their own people to understand that the state is not accidental, temporary, or merely political. They want it to feel anchored in something larger. In Mesopotamia, that larger frame was divine order. Kings ruled because the gods authorized rule. Temples mattered because the gods occupied the sacred center of life. Ritual mattered because the relationship between heaven and earth required maintenance. Public images mattered because they translated all of this into visible form. The Mushkhushshu belonged to that translation. One reason symbolic animals were so powerful in the ancient Near East is that animals already came with strong emotional meaning. People lived close to them. They knew what a lion could do. They knew the force of a bull, the quickness of a bird of prey, the danger of a serpent. A sacred image did not have to begin from nothing. It could borrow from reactions people already had. Then it could raise those reactions to a higher level by combining features or placing them in divine settings. That is exactly how the Mushkhushshu works. It gathers the old fear of the snake, the old respect for the predator, the old awareness that horns and hybrid forms point towards sacred power, and it turns those things into a single creature fit for theology and empire. This is not unique to Babylon. Across the ancient Near East, power often surrounded itself with beings that were more than ordinary animals. Assyrian palaces used Lamasu, those enormous winged bullmen, at gateways. Egyptian kings used the Sphinx, a body of leonine power joined to royal intelligence and divine kingship. Hittite and Syrian sites used lions, hybrid creatures, storm god symbols, and other monumental forms at entrances and sacred places. Everyone understood that thresholds mattered, and that power should meet you before a human official had to explain anything. The doorway itself could instruct. The wall itself could warn. The image itself could announce that you were entering a place where ordinary rules bent toward a greater order. The Mushkhushshu belongs to that larger regional habit, but it has its own particular function. The Lamasu say guardianship with intelligence and mass. The Sphinx says royal mystery and concentrated authority. The Mushkhushshu says divine command over dangerous force. It is a sacred beast that looks like danger already arranged into obedience. That is why it works so well for Marduk and Babylon. It does not show chaos loose in the world. It shows chaos absorbed into legitimate power. It says that the city and its god have access to energies that ordinary humans would fear, but those energies are not in rebellion. They are standing in line. That point is easy to miss if we use the word monster too casually. Monster is not a useless word, but it can flatten the ancient meaning if we are not careful. In modern speech, monster often means an enemy or a being outside moral order. In the older Near Eastern context, a monstrous form might simply mean a form capable of carrying greater symbolic force. Hybrid bodies were not automatically evil. They could be protective, divine, royal, or apotropaic, which is a useful word for something meant to turn away danger. The frightening shape itself could be part of the protection. People did not always keep safety and terror as separate visual categories. Sometimes the thing that guarded you needed to look as though it could ruin the day of anything foolish enough to cross the line. That is exactly the kind of logic that makes the Mushkhushshu more than a beast from a story. Its body is persuasive because it feels assembled out of forces humans already understood as serious. No one looking at it would mistake it for livestock. No one would confuse it with some peaceful field creature whose greatest ambition was to stand around chewing. It is visibly not part of everyday domestic life. That matters because divine authority in the ancient Near East was not imagined as ordinary life made slightly bigger. It was imagined as something categorically higher. Sacred kingship needed symbols that could express that separation. The Mushkhushshu does so without becoming incomprehensible. It stays readable while remaining alien enough to create awe. Awe is an important word here, because awe is different from simple fear. Fear alone pushes people away. Awe freezes them in place long enough for meaning to land. States, temples, and kings all benefit from awe. A temple wants worshippers to feel that they stand before more than stone and wood. A king wants his palace to feel like the centre of a serious order, not an overgrown administrative office. A city wants its gates to suggest legitimacy greater than whatever argument a rival kingdom is currently making. Awe is the emotional space where power becomes believable. The The Mushkhushshu helps create that space because it is memorable, ordered, and unsettling all at once. There is another layer to this. In the ancient Near East, divine authority was not always best shown by calm perfection. Very often it was shown by command over volatility. Storm gods rule storms. Warrior gods rule battle. Kings prove legitimacy by conquering enemies and then restoring order. The highest power is not necessarily the one that avoids dangerous forces, it is the one that masters them. That is why a sacred beast can look dangerous and still belong on the side of law. It is not a contradiction. It is evidence. If the god can command the dragon, then the god is truly powerful. If the king rules under that god, then the king's position gains weight. The viewer does not need a long lecture to understand the basic idea. The image delivers it quickly. That may be one reason hybrid sacred animals appear so often around royal and temple spaces. They show command over multiple realms at once. A lion rules the ground through muscle. A bird of prey rules through height and speed. A serpent moves through hidden places with unnerving confidence. Combine those, and you have a being that seems to exceed natural limits. That makes it a good fit for divine presence. Gods, after all, were not confined to one domain in a simple physical sense. They could govern weather, kingship, fertility, war, wisdom, and death. A composite beast reflects that same idea in visual form. It is more than one thing because the power behind it is more than one thing. The Mushkhushshu also gains meaning from where it appears. Context does a great deal of work in ancient art. A serpent in the wild and a serpent on a sacred gate are not read the same way. A lion in a hunting scene and a lion on a processional route do not mean the same thing. The Mushkhushshu on the Ishtar gate attached to Marduk's sphere, repeated in ordered lines on a monumental structure, cannot reasonably be interpreted as a loose menace. The city has framed it too carefully. It is part of official meaning. That official meaning includes divine authority, because the whole architectural program is already speaking in the language of the gods. This is why public display matters so much. Private fear creates one kind of image. Official public display creates another. If a culture truly regarded a creature only as an enemy to be destroyed, that creature might appear in stories, omens, or scenes of triumph. It would not necessarily be given a dignified place on one of the great ceremonial structures of the capital. The Mushkhushshu receives that place because it does not signify defeat. It signifies association. It belongs near the power center. That immediately changes how we should read it. We also need to remember that ordinary people in the ancient Near East did not experience religion only through texts. Most people were not sitting around with shelves of carefully organized tablets, comparing fine points of theology after dinner. They experienced religion through ritual, procession, offerings, songs, architecture, images, inherited habits, and public space. That means the visual world carried a great deal of theological weight. The Mushkhushshu was one of the ways Babylon made theology visible to everyone, including people who would never read a formal text about Marduk's greatness. The dragon on the wall did part of the teaching, and it taught something very specific. It taught that divine authority was not abstract. It could take shape. It could be seen in materials, in processional routes, in gates, in repeated animal forms, in the way a city arranged its public surfaces. That is one reason ancient empires invested so heavily in monumental art. They were not simply showing off, though they were certainly not opposed to that. They were making rule visible. The Mushkhushshu, with its unforgettable body, helped Babylon do this in a way that even foreign visitors would struggle to ignore. It is also useful to think about who the audience was. The audience was not only priests and elites who knew every liturgical detail. It included traders, diplomats, labourers, soldiers, provincials, enemies, pilgrims, and anyone else moving through Babylon's controlled spaces. The image had to work across different levels of knowledge. Someone deeply trained in temple tradition could read the creature in one way. someone less informed could still understand the broader point. This city is backed by powers larger than human life, and those powers are not weak. A strong symbol succeeds when it can carry both levels at once. The Mushkhushshu does exactly that. The creature also gains force by standing within a network of other symbols. It is rarely completely alone in meaning. Beside lions, bulls, gods, walls, inscriptions and rituals, it becomes part of a coordinated statement. The ancient Near East was very good at coordinated statements. A king did not rely on one sign of legitimacy. He used genealogy, temple support, divine favour, military victory, building programs, ritual performance, and public art together. The Mushkhushshu is one piece in that larger machinery, but it is a particularly sharp piece because it condenses so much into a single form. It can carry ideas about divine favour, sacred danger, protection, state order, and inherited antiquity all at once. There is a quiet brilliance in that. The creature is specific enough to be tied to Marduk, but broad enough to resonate with older regional ideas about sacred beasts and divine command. That gives it reach. It is one of those symbols that can satisfy the local political need of Babylon, while still drawing strength from a much older Near Eastern habit of giving power an animal body. That is probably part of why it endured. It was not trapped in a tiny meaning. It lived inside a large tradition. This broader regional frame also helps explain why ancient people were not troubled by the creature's strangeness, in the way modern viewers often are. We sometimes look at the Mushkhushshu and think, how did anyone settle on that design? But the ancient Near East already had a long visual history of composite beings, sacred animals, and hybrid protectors. The culture had room for creatures that crossed categories because the divine world itself crossed categories. Gods moved between city and cosmos, heaven and earth, blessing and punishment, wisdom and violence. Why should their signs remain biologically tidy? In such a world, the Mushkhushshu is not bizarre in a random way. It is appropriate. The more we understand that, the less useful the simple monster label becomes. Monster suggests something outside the system. The Mushkhushshu is inside the system. It is part of how the system explains itself. That alone makes it different from a mere nightmare beast. It is not there to represent the breakdown of order. It is there to represent order's access to forms of power beyond the human and beyond the ordinary animal world. That is a much more interesting role, and a much more ancient one. So when Babylon placed the Mushkhushshu on its gate, it was not just showing that it knew a good dragon when it saw one. It was telling the world that divine authority can wear scales and claws without ceasing to be legitimate. It was telling viewers that power is most convincing when it looks capable of ruling danger, not merely hiding from it. It was using a creature that carried older Near Eastern habits of sacred symbolism and letting that creature speak for the city's place in the cosmos. Not just a monster then, a sign, a warning, a promise, a statement that Marduk's order extended all the way to the threshold of the city. And once a creature begins doing that kind of work, it is not hard to see why rulers would want it close. A dragon that can carry divine authority in public space is too useful to remain only on the walls of temples and gates. Before long, kings and empires start drawing nearer, because if the god's beast helps legitimize heaven's order, it can also help legitimize the throne that claims to serve it. Once the Mushkhushshu had become firmly attached to Marduk and had taken its place on the great public surfaces of Babylon, it was never going to remain only a religious image in the narrow sense. A creature that could express divine authority so clearly was far too useful to leave in the background. Rulers wanted it close for the same reason rulers everywhere want the strongest available symbols close, because power is never satisfied with being powerful only in fact. It also wants to look rightful. It wants to look ancient. It wants to look protected, chosen, and larger than the temporary human body of the king, who happens to be wearing the crown at the moment. The Mushkhushshu helped do all of that. Kingship in Mesopotamia was never merely administrative. A king was not imagined as the head of a secular institution, who handled roads, taxes, grain, diplomacy, and the occasional military disaster while the gods stayed politely above the situation, kingship existed inside a divine frame. A ruler might be chosen by the gods, favoured by them, corrected by them, or judged by them. But he was never outside their order. His success needed heavenly backing. His monuments needed sacred legitimacy. His victories needed to be readable as more than brute force. Without that frame, rule looked thinner. With it, rule could be presented as part of the way the world was meant to be. That is why rulers invested so much in temples, inscriptions, ritual, and sacred architecture. They were not only showing devotion, although devotion certainly mattered. They were proving that their kingship was aligned with cosmic order. The city stood because the gods allowed it. The king ruled because the gods approved. The walls held because divine protection extended over them. And if a sacred beast associated with one of the greatest gods in the system could be made visible in royal contexts, all the better. The dragon did not simply add drama. It added legitimacy. There is something very revealing in the fact that the Mushkhushshu appears where royal power wanted to be seen. It is one thing for a creature to exist in myth. It is another for kings to place it into the material skin of empire. When a ruler chooses a symbol again and again, that symbol is doing political work. It is telling the viewer how to interpret the ruler's authority. In the case of the Mushkhushshu, the message is especially strong because the creature does not merely suggest protection. It suggests command over dangerous force. That is exactly the sort of claim kings love to make. A ruler does not want to seem like a man nervously hiding behind walls. He wants to seem like a man whose rule is backed by powers that make walls meaningful in the first place. This was especially true in Babylon, where kingship and the cult of Marduk were deeply entangled. A Babylonian ruler could not present himself as fully legitimate without reference to the city's great god. Marduk was not ornamental. He was central. His temple mattered. His festivals mattered. His favour mattered. A king who built in his honour, ruled under his authority and placed Marduk's sacred beast in public view was not simply decorating the kingdom with tasteful mythology. He was placing his reign inside the divine grammar of Babylon itself. He was saying in effect that his government did not stand apart from sacred order. It flowed from it. That is one reason the great building programs of kings like Nebuchadnezzar II matter so much. Monumental construction was not just practical, or even just commemorative. It was ideological. Building on a grand scale allowed the king to write himself into sacred geography. He could expand walls, raise gates, rebuild temples, improve processional routes, and in doing so present himself as the one who restored, strengthened, and glorified the world the gods had entrusted to him. Every brick became an argument. Every relief became a claim. Every animal on the wall joined the case being made on behalf of the throne. And what a useful creature the Mushkhushshu was for that purpose. A lion is powerful, but many rulers can use lions. A bull is powerful, but bulls are widely meaningful across the region. The Mushkhushshu is more specific. It speaks directly to Babylon, to Marduk, and to a kind of sacred authority that feels older and less ordinary than the simpler language of kingship alone. By drawing that creature close, a ruler could wrap himself not only in visible power, but in Babylon's particular claim to divine centrality. The dragon was not just strong, it was the right kind of strong. There is also the matter of empire, which changes the scale of everything it touches. A local king needs symbols that persuade his immediate subjects. An imperial ruler needs symbols that can travel, symbols that can impress foreigners, conquereds, envoys, merchants, and provincial elites. Empire depends on visibility. It cannot personally explain itself to every person it absorbs. It needs images, ceremonies, monuments, and repeated forms that carry the message on its behalf. The Mushkhushshu was excellent at this because it was memorable on sight. You did not need to know every line of Babylonian theology to understand that this was not the emblem of a weak or accidental state. For conquered peoples or visiting delegations, symbols like the Mushkhushshu could do important emotional work. They made the empire feel old, chosen, and difficult to challenge. That matters because empires are always, beneath all their confidence, vulnerable to the suspicion that they are temporary. Every empire knows that rivals existed before it and may exist after it. One way to fight that vulnerability is through claims of sacred permanence. If the ruler is merely a successful warlord, then his time may pass. If he rules under the authority of the gods and in continuity with an ancient sacred order, then resistance begins to look not only dangerous but improper. The dragon on the wall helps create exactly that mood. Rulers also wanted the dragon close because kingship itself was a dangerous performance. A Mesopotamian king had to look strong enough to defend the land, pious enough to satisfy the gods, competent enough to manage the state, and elevated enough to stand apart from ordinary humanity without losing contact with the practical world of rule. That is not an easy balance. Symbols helped manage it. The Mushkhushshu, in particular, allowed kingship to borrow divine danger without collapsing into mere chaos. It let the ruler stand near something fearsome without appearing threatened by it. That is a very useful visual arrangement. A king who is comfortable beside the dragon is a king presented as comfortable beside sacred power itself. This is one of the oldest political tricks in human history, and one of the most effective. Rulers seek nearness to symbols that exceed them, because those symbols can lend size to otherwise fragile human claims. The crown is metal until the culture fills it with meaning. The throne is furniture until ritual makes it more. The dragon is an image until public power places it beside the king and says, "This too belongs to the order I govern under." Once that happens, the ruler grows in the imagination, which is often where rule is won or lost before armies even move. It is worth noticing that the Mushkhushshu did not need to appear as a king's personal emblem in the simplistic modern sense in order to serve royal power. It was enough that it stood in spaces kings controlled, built, restored, and ceremonially used. Royal architecture does not merely reflect the king, it extends him. When Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon, the city itself became an expression of his kingship. The Ishtar Gate, the processional way, the temple complexes, the fortifications, the inscriptions, all of it joined together into one giant statement. So when the dragon marched across the walls, it was also marching through the visual field of the king's authority. It belonged to Marduk first, but through Marduk it strengthened the throne. That relationship between god and king is essential. Mesopotamian rulers rarely wanted to appear independent of the gods, because independence was not legitimacy. No sensible Babylonian king would present himself as a self-made master who owed heaven nothing. That would have sounded less like confidence, and more like a good way to invite disaster. Instead, the ruler sought proximity to divine sanction. The closer he could place his reign to the city's sacred centre, the stronger his claim became. Since the Mushkhushshu had already become a powerful sign of Marduk's authority, keeping it close was another way of keeping the king close to the god, without overstepping the dangerous line between devotion and divine rivalry. Kings had to walk that line carefully. They were exalted, but not gods in the same way the high deities were gods. They could claim favour, mission and chosen status, but not complete equivalence. That meant they needed symbols that elevated them while still pointing upward beyond them. The Mushkhushshu did this beautifully. It did not say, "The king is the dragon." It said, "The king rules in a world structured by the god whose dragon this is." That is a much safer and more effective message. It glorifies the ruler by embedding him in divine order rather than by pretending he invented that order himself. There is also a practical side to why rulers wanted the dragon near. Ancient government relied on public feeling more than modern bureaucratic states often admit. Fear, awe, reverence, and confidence mattered. A subject population that believed the state was sacred was easier to rule than one that saw only taxation and armed men. A foreign envoy entering a city framed by powerful divine images was more likely to feel the weight of that city's prestige. A local elite taking part in ritual processions through such spaces was repeatedly taught where authority lived. The dragon helped produce that atmosphere, and atmosphere is one of the most underappreciated tools of empire. In a world without mass media, atmosphere had to be built from stone, brick, procession, sound, colour, and repeated visual forms. You could not simply send out a polished imperial statement to every household and hope it shaped the imagination. The city itself had to become the statement. Sacred symbols had to do part of the work. That is one reason monumental animals mattered so much. They could be seen by everyone. They crossed differences in literacy. They operated on the body as well as the mind. A person standing beneath the walls of Babylon did not need to pass a complicated theological argument to understand that the place claimed unusual backing. The Mushkhushshu was one of the ways Babylon made that claim immediate. Another reason rulers wanted it close is that empire always needs continuity. It needs to persuade people that the current order is not only strong, but rightful in time. A new dynasty can feel fragile if it looks too new. A growing empire can seem temporary if it has no roots. Ancient rulers solved this problem constantly by attaching themselves to older sacred traditions. They restored old temples, invoked ancient gods, copied venerable formulas, and adopted symbols that already carried authority. The Mushkhushshu was ideal for this because it was not merely a Babylonian novelty. It had older religious depth behind it. By using it, rulers could tap into a sense of antiquity greater than their own individual reigns. That oldness matters. Power becomes more convincing when it looks inherited rather than improvised. A king may be talented, but talent dies with the king. A sacred order is harder to dismiss. If the dragon already belongs to an old divine world, and now that dragon stands beside Babylon's god, and now Babylon's god authorizes the empire, then the empire starts to look like the latest expression of something ancient, rather than the latest gamble of one ambitious court. That is exactly the sort of story rulers want their subjects to believe. The dragon also helped rulers communicate a harder truth about kingship. That order depends on managed force. This is not always said politely, but it is nearly always true. States keep peace partly by holding violence in reserve. Kings defend cities by proving they can break enemies. Divine order in Mesopotamian thought often includes mastery over dangerous powers rather than their absence. The Mushkhushshu expresses that beautifully. It is force disciplined into allegiance. It is danger brought under command. A ruler standing near that image is making a statement about his own office. He too claims to take the dangerous realities of the world and bind them into lawful order. That is probably one reason the creature feels so different from a defeated chaos monster in combat art. It is not shown being crushed beneath the righteous foot of a hero. It is shown in alignment with the city and its god. That alignment is politically valuable because it lets rulers associate themselves not merely with victory over disorder, but with possession of the means to govern it afterward. Winning a war is impressive. Turning victory into stable rule is far harder. The dragon says the ruler belongs to that second category. He is not merely triumphant, he is established. There is a subtle emotional logic in that too. Subjects may admire raw strength, but they live under established authority. What they need from kingship is not endless battle, but a durable order that feels guarded from both enemies and chaos. The Mushkhushshu, because it looks dangerous yet controlled, offers a visual promise of exactly that. The danger has not vanished. It stands watch on the king's side. That is more reassuring than pretending danger does not exist at all. Ancient people were not sentimental about the world. They knew it was full of threats. A symbol that acknowledged threat while claiming to master it was far more believable than one that offered only soft serenity. Rulers also wanted the dragon close because sacred animals help solve a problem of scale. Human kings are finite. They age, fail, become ill, make poor decisions, die, and are replaced. Empire, if it is to endure, must look larger than that cycle. Monumental symbols provide continuity where bodies cannot. A king may come and go, but the dragon remains on the wall. A reign may end, but the sacred beast still marks the city as belonging to a divine order. That continuity strengthens the office even when it cannot preserve the individual. In a sense, rulers borrowed immortality from symbols like the Mushkhushshu, or at least the appearance of it. The image was also useful because it could stand at several levels at once. To a priest or scholar, it could point toward Marduk, older traditions and sacred associations with deep theological meaning. To an ordinary resident, it could say the city is protected and powerful. To a foreign envoy, it could suggest that Babylon's confidence was not just military but cosmic. To the king himself, it could be part of the machinery through which he saw his own reign reflected back at him as something anchored in heaven. Good imperial symbols always work at more than one level. The Mushkhushshu does this with unusual efficiency, and once a ruler has a symbol that effective, he tends to use it not only to protect the city from outside judgment, but to shape his own place within the city. Royal ceremonies, building inscriptions, public processions and temple relationships all become easier to stage when the visual world supports the same message. The dragon's nearness to royal space helps close the gap between throne and temple without erasing their difference. It reminds everyone that kingship lives under divine authority, but close enough to it to share in its reflected splendour. That is a difficult balance to strike, and the Mushkhushshu helps strike it. It is also telling that powerful states so often prefer symbols that are a little severe. Gentler symbols may comfort, but severe symbols command. Empire generally prefers command. A dragon beast on the gate does not ask for admiration in a humble tone. It assumes significance. That assumption itself is politically useful. It teaches viewers how to stand in relation to power, not as equals, not as detached observers, as people entering a space already ordered by something greater than themselves. So rulers wanted the dragon close because it made their authority feel older, larger, and more divinely anchored than a crown or inscription could do alone. It linked the throne to Marduk without confusing the two. It helped transform architecture into a language of legitimacy. It made empire visible as sacred order rather than mere domination. It allowed kings to present themselves as servants and beneficiaries of divine command, while still appearing surrounded by fearsome force. It carried the oldness of inherited religion into the brightness of royal display. And in a world where power had to be seen to be believed, that was invaluable. The more that rulers drew the dragon into the life of the city, the more natural it became for the creature to stand not only near kings and walls, but near ritual itself. Because once a symbol is this close to God and throne at the same time, it is only a matter of time before the temple world pulls it even deeper into its own meanings, where protection, sacred fear and ceremonial presence begin to overlap in ways that make the dragon feel even more at home. When a creature like the Mushkhushshu appears on a city gate, it is already telling you something about protection, but gates are only part of the story. The deeper meaning of the dragon becomes clearer when you place it in the wider temple world of Mesopotamia, because temples were not just religious buildings in the modern sense. They were not quiet places people visited once a week for personal reflection and then left behind as life returned to normal. They were economic centres, ritual centres, political centres, storehouses, sacred residences of the gods, and meeting points between the human city and the divine order above it. If a sacred beast belonged anywhere, it belonged in that environment, where the language of protection, fear, holiness and authority was already woven into daily life. That is the setting in which the Mushkhushshu starts to make even more sense. A beast like this is not only useful on a monumental gate because it looks strong, it is useful because the temple world of Mesopotamia already expected sacred power to be guarded, marked, and made visible through symbols that were greater than ordinary life. Temples were not neutral spaces, they were charged spaces. The god of the city was thought to dwell there in a real and serious sense through cult statues, ritual presence, offerings, and ceremonial life. The temple was where order had to be maintained with great care, because if the relationship between city and god weakened, then everything from kingship to harvests to civic stability could be affected. In a world like that, protection was not a decorative idea. It was an everyday necessity. This is where sacred fear comes in, and sacred fear is different from panic. Panic is disorder. Sacred fear is controlled awareness that you are near something higher, stronger, and not answerable to ordinary human comfort. Mesopotamian religion was full of that feeling. The gods were not imagined as distant moral metaphors floating pleasantly above the world. They had wills, preferences, powers, tempers, and rights. They could bless, but they could also punish. They deserved offerings, maintenance, honour, and ritual precision. Entering their world was not casual. A creature like the Mushkhushshu fits this environment perfectly, because it gives form to the idea that the divine sphere is not soft. It is ordered, but it is serious. It protects, but not in a way that makes human beings forget their place. That is one reason protective figures in the ancient Near East so often look intimidating. They are not there to reassure in the modern commercial sense, like a smiling mascot put near a door to make visitors feel welcomed. They are there to mark the seriousness of the threshold. A sacred threshold should not feel ordinary. A holy space should not feel unguarded. A protective image must do two jobs at once. It must warn away danger, and it must remind the person approaching that this space belongs to powers beyond everyday human control. The Mushkhushshu, with its scales, horn, claws, and composite body, does both jobs at once. It is not merely a sign that the temple is safe. It is a sign that the temple is safe because something formidable stands within the order that defends it. Temples in Mesopotamia were also full of ritual movement. Priests carried out offerings, incense rose, food and drink were presented, statues were washed, clothed, anointed, and cared for. Festivals moved divine images between sacred locations. Prayers were recited, incantations were performed. Processional routes connected urban space to temple space. All of this means that the religious life of the city was never only intellectual, it was material, physical, and visual. The god's presence was managed through repeated acts. In such a world, symbols were not passive, they participated. A sacred beast shown in temple or ceremonial context was not just an illustration of doctrine, it helped create the atmosphere in which doctrine became lived experience. That is especially important when we think about protection. Protection in Mesopotamian religion was not abstract. It was done. It was built into walls, spoken in incantations, baked into figurines, placed at thresholds, invoked in ritual formulas, and expressed through divine images. People wanted protection from illness, from bad omens, from enemies, from restless spirits, from divine anger, from disorder in the household, and from political collapse on a larger scale. The temple stood at the centre of many of those concerns because the city's relationship with its god was a collective form of security. If the god was properly honoured, the city stood in a safer condition than if the god had been neglected. So a creature like the Mushkhushshu, when placed inside that world, becomes more than a dramatic emblem of Marduk. It becomes part of the broader system by which divine order defended human life. There is an important distinction here between protection and comfort. Modern people often blur those together, but ancient religion did not always do so. Something can protect you without making you feel relaxed. A wall protects by excluding. A guard protects by threatening. A ritual protects by establishing boundaries. A sacred beast protects by making danger think twice before crossing into the wrong space. The Mushkhushshu belongs to that second kind of protection. It is not a soft image. It is not trying to soothe anyone into forgetting that the sacred world contains force. It is trying to make clear that force is aligned correctly. That alignment matters because the ancient Near East was full of beings, powers, and imagined threats that were not aligned correctly. Mesopotamian literature and ritual texts speak often of demons, illness-bearing forces, curse material, malevolent ghosts, bad dreams, divine displeasure, and other forms of unseen danger. The line between order and disorder had to be maintained. Houses could be protected with charms and figurines. People could be protected with incantations. Temples and palaces could be protected with monumental guardian forms. Once you understand that broader landscape of defensive ritual and sacred maintenance, the Mushkhushshu begins to look less unusual. Of course, a powerful god would have a sacred beast near his spaces. Of course, dangerous imagery would be used to guard holy places. Of course, protection would wear a severe face. There is something else to notice in the temple world. Sacred presence required distance as much as nearness. The gods were close in one sense because they inhabited the city through temples, statues, festivals, and offerings. But they were also set apart. Not everyone had the same access. Not every space in a temple was open in the same way. Ritual specialists mattered because contact with the sacred had to be managed. That means holy spaces were full of gradients of access, degrees of purity, rules of approach, and layers of seriousness. The Mushkhushshu fits beautifully into that structure because it is itself a creature of the threshold. It visually says that not every line should be crossed casually. Even when the creature appears in royal and public architecture, that threshold quality stays with it. The Ishtar gate is public, but it is still a controlled entrance. A processional route is public, but it is public in a ritualized way. The temple world teaches us that the sacred often travels outward into civic architecture without losing its boundary-making function. The dragon on the wall still tells you where power lives, where proper order begins, and what kind of authority guards the place. The same logic that belongs to temple thresholds extends outward into city thresholds. Babylon was, in effect, making the city itself an extension of sacred space under Marduk's authority. That helps explain the emotional tone of the creature. The Mushkhushshu is not merely fierce. It is composed. It does not look frantic. It does not rage or twist in wild disorder. It advances in ordered form. That is exactly what sacred protection should look like in a temple world. Disorder is real, but it does not rule here. The beast is powerful, but it belongs to an established pattern. It is fear placed inside ritual order. That is the heart of sacred fear. You're meant to understand that the divine world is not harmless, yet you're also meant to understand that its power is not random. The temple is where force is rightly arranged. This is one reason protective beings in Mesopotamian art often feel formal rather than dramatic. They are not caught in accidental motion. They stand, advance, or hold position in a controlled way. Ritual itself is repetitive, measured, and structured. Sacred images often mirror that. The Mushkhushshu on a gate or in temple association is not attacking. It is standing in the proper place within the proper order. That visual discipline matters because it tells the viewer that this power is not loose in the world. It belongs to the god whose world the temple maintains. The connection to Marduk deepens the temple meaning further. Marduk was not simply a warrior or a storm god in a narrow sense. In Babylonian theology, he became a god of broad and central authority, closely tied to the city's highest religious claims. His temple, Esagila, was one of the great sacred centers of Babylon. If the Mushkhushshu was associated with Marduk, then its ritual meaning cannot be separated from the prestige of that temple world. It would have belonged to an environment where the city's divine center was enacted through offerings, festivals, priestly labor, and ceremonial movement. The dragon was therefore not just attached to one god on paper. It belonged to a living sacred network in which that god's authority was renewed and displayed. There is also a practical ritual reason rulers and priests alike would value such imagery. Ritual works partly through repetition and recognition. People need to know what powers are being invoked, what signs belong to which gods, and how sacred order is visually marked. The Mushkhushshu is excellent at recognition because it is unmistakable. No one confuses it with a horse, a dog, or some harmless courtyard visitor. Its body immediately tells you that you are dealing with divine symbolism of a very high order. In a ceremonial environment, that kind of visual certainty is useful. It helps stabilize meaning. It tells participants, even at a glance, whose sphere they are moving through. And because the creature is so distinctive, it can also carry memory. A city resident seeing the Mushkhushshu in public relief, temple decoration, or festival routes would learn to associate the form with Marduk, with protected space, with formal processions, with royal building, and with divine seriousness. Over time, the body of the beast itself becomes a kind of shorthand for a whole structure of belief. That is a powerful thing for any religion to have. Symbols that condense a great deal into one image tend to survive because they are efficient. The Mushkhushshu says sacred power, Marduk, protection, threshold, and official divine order all at once. This also sheds light on why sacred fear was useful rather than unfortunate. A modern state often prefers to seem approachable, even when it is armed and deeply bureaucratic underneath. Ancient temple systems did not need to hide the seriousness of power so carefully. A certain amount of fear was appropriate. If one approached the divine with no sense of scale, then one approached badly. Fear, rightly ordered, produced respect, caution, ritual care, and willingness to maintain the proper boundaries. The Mushkhushshu participates in that pedagogy. It teaches the viewer not to be casual. It reminds people that sacred spaces are not simply human spaces with better decoration. There is something almost administrative about this when you look closely enough. Mesopotamian religion was full of maintenance. Gods received offerings on schedule. Temples needed supplies. Priests performed regular duties. Ritual calendars mattered. Sacred objects were kept. Festivals were organized. Protective measures were not left to improvisation. A creature like the Mushkhushshu fits this world because it is not an isolated burst of imagination. It is part of a system that values ordered relations between human and divine realms. Even fear is managed. Even protection is institutional. The dragon becomes not just a mythic beast, but a participant in the routine seriousness of sacred order. Of course, this does not mean every ordinary person spent their day walking around consciously thinking, I must now contemplate the ritual administrative significance of the divine dragon. Human beings have always been more casual, more distracted, and more interested in lunch than the tidy summaries of historians sometimes suggest. But that does not reduce the power of the image. People do not have to analyze a symbol in formal language for it to shape them. They only need to live among it. A child growing up in Babylon, a laborer carrying goods through a ceremonial route, a priest performing a known rite, a foreign visitor entering the city, all of them would absorb the same broad lesson. This place is under serious protection, and its god is not represented by anything ordinary. There is also a strong possibility that the creature's older background as a serpent beast added depth to its temple meaning. Serpents often stand near boundaries between life and death, surface and underworld, visible and hidden. That does not automatically make them evil, it makes them potent. In a temple world concerned with divine order across all levels of existence, a creature carrying old serpent force can be especially useful. It suggests access to deep powers, to things older than any single human king, to a sacred order that reaches beneath the surface of daily life. By the time Babylon presents the Mushkhushshu in its most famous form, those older resonances may already be folded into the creature's authority. The temple world likes such depth. It likes symbols that feel rooted below the level of immediate explanation. At the same time, the Mushkhushshu is not as purely underworld-oriented as some serpent beings in other traditions might be. That is important too. It has been raised into the service of a high god in a great city. It is not a lurking temple basement problem. It is public, official, and aligned with Marduk. So what the temple world seems to do is refine the older force rather than erase it. The creature still feels ancient and unsettling, but now it stands in an ordered hierarchy. That combination is exactly what makes it such a powerful sacred symbol. It brings depth without chaos. This may also explain why the creature feels at home beside ritual objects, formal architecture, and state religion instead of only in storytelling. Some mythic beasts remain primarily narrative. They belong to episodes, battles, and remembered adventures. The Mushkhushshu feels different because it is so deeply structural. It belongs to the places where religion is enacted and authority is displayed. The temple world is the natural home for that kind of creature, because temples are where structures of meaning become physical and repetitive. The beast does not need a dramatic speech. It only needs to stand in its place again and again while the rituals continue around it. That sense of place is crucial. Sacred fear depends on context. The same creature in a folk tale scratched on a private object or imagined in isolation would not have the same effect as the creature placed in the temple city environment of Babylon. There the dragon is supported by walls, gates, priests, processions, offerings, royal patronage, and the prestige of Marduk himself. The whole city helps tell you how to read it. The temple world gives the creature its full voice, and that voice says several things at once. It says the sacred is guarded. It says protection is active. It says divine order is not weak. It says the city belongs to powers that do not need human approval to be real. It says fear has been given a place and a task. That is not a small achievement for one image. It is one reason the Mushkhushshu lasts so strongly in memory. A creature that can hold ritual meaning, protective meaning, political meaning, and emotional meaning all together is a creature built to survive the collapse of empires. Still, even in a world of ritual and temple order, the Mushkhushshu did not stand alone. Mesopotamia was crowded with powerful animal symbols, sacred beasts, lions, bulls, serpents, hybrid guardians, and other forms that helped cities and gods speak visually. The dragon becomes even clearer when set beside those others, because only then do we see exactly what kind of creature it was and what kind of creature it was not. By the time you have spent a while with the Mushkhushshu, it starts to feel unique enough that you could almost imagine it standing outside the rest of Mesopotamian sacred imagery, as though Babylon had invented one especially strange dragon and then simply placed it wherever it needed a little extra authority. But that would miss something important. The Mushkhushshu makes the most sense when you place it beside the other powerful beasts of the Mesopotamian world, because the ancient Near East did not imagine divine authority through one creature alone. It used a whole animal language. Lions, bulls, serpents, eagle-like forms, hybrid guardians, storm creatures, underworld beasts, and composite beings all helped express what the gods were like, what kingship claimed, what protection looked like, and what kind of danger lived just beyond the edge of order. The Mushkhushshu stands out, but it stands out inside a crowded and highly intentional company. That company matters because ancient people did not choose sacred animals randomly. They did not sit down with a list of available beasts and pick whatever seemed dramatic enough for the wall. The animals that appear again and again in Mesopotamian art are there because they already carried strong meanings. The lion was powerful before any king borrowed its image. The bull was forceful before any storm god took it into his symbolic orbit. The serpent had deep associations before it became part of a composite dragon body. What Mesopotamian religion and kingship did was gather those already meaningful creatures, connect them with the gods, and then use them in combinations that could express more than any one ordinary animal could say alone. Take the lion first, because the lion is one of the easiest symbols to understand. You do not need a cuneiform tablet to explain why powerful ancient states liked lions. Lions are large, dangerous, and visibly dominant. They move with the kind of confidence that makes most other animals look as though they are still working through some personal doubts. They hunt effectively. They defend territory. They suggest power without needing explanation. In the ancient Near East, that made them ideal for royal imagery, divine imagery, and especially for associations with goddesses or gods connected to war, strength, and sovereignty. In Babylon, lions on the Ishtar gate are associated with Ishtar, and that makes perfect sense. Ishtar is a goddess of love, war, sexuality, force, and political power. A lion suits her because it carries aggression, beauty, and authority all at once. But the lion, for all its power, is still recognisably an animal from the ordinary world. An impressive ordinary animal, certainly, and not one most people would wish to meet in a confined space, but still an animal known to nature. That is one reason the Mushkhushshu matters so much by comparison. Where the lion says power in a direct and familiar form, the Mushkhushshu says power in a form that has already crossed into the sacred and composite. The lion is formidable, but understandable. The dragon beast is formidable and less easily contained by normal categories. Babylon used both because the city needed both messages. One says divine force through a known predator. The other says divine force through a being assembled beyond ordinary life. The bull works differently. Bulls in the ancient Near East often signal strength, fertility, storm power, and endurance. A great bull or aurochs-like figure carries weight. It suggests force that does not need speed to dominate. Bulls are less about the elegant precision of the predator, and more about impact, mass, and relentless power. That makes them especially useful for storm gods and male divine strength. In Babylonian context, the bull on the Ishtar gate is associated with Adad, the storm god. Again, this is not an arbitrary pairing. Storms strike hard, flood fields, shake buildings, and remind human beings that nature does not negotiate. A bull gives visual form to that kind of overwhelming force. It plants itself in the world and dares anything nearby to argue. Now compare that with the Mushkhushshu. The bull is heavy, grounded, and blunt in its symbolism. It tells you power through sheer presence. The Mushkhushshu is lighter, more complex and more unnerving. It does not threaten by weight alone. It threatens through combination. It feels as though it can move differently, strike differently, watch differently. Where the bull says impact, the Mushkhushshu says command over several kinds of power at once. That is why the dragon is so effective for Marduk. Marduk, as Babylon understood him, is not only raw force, he is divine kingship, cosmic order, victory, legitimacy and control. The bull may express one strong divine quality very well, but the Mushkhushshu can carry a broader field of meanings. Serpents bring us closer to the dragon's deeper roots. A serpent is one of the oldest and most flexible sacred symbols in human history, and Mesopotamia is no exception. Snakes belong near the ground, near cracks, ruins, thresholds, burrows, riverbanks, and hidden places. They strike suddenly. They move without limbs, which gives them an unnatural smoothness compared with hoofed or pawed animals. They shed skin and seem reborn. They disappear and return. All of that gives them symbolic reach. They can signify danger, wisdom, oldness, healing, underworld proximity, sacred protection, or hidden force depending on the context. In Mesopotamian religion, serpent imagery appears in several connections, including gods associated with the underworld, healing, and deeper layers of divine power. The Mushkhushshu borrows heavily from that serpent world. Its long body and scaled form keep that deep reptilian atmosphere alive. This matters because if the creature were only a lion with a horn, it would look like a modified royal animal. If it were only a bird-lion hybrid, it would move closer to other guardian forms. But the serpent line running through its body gives it age and strangeness. It feels less like a decorated beast and more like something with roots in older, deeper parts of Mesopotamian thought. That is one reason it can stand beside Marduk without becoming predictable. It carries older, sacred force into Babylon's imperial visual language. At the same time, the Mushkhushshu is not merely a serpent. That is important. A serpent alone might carry too much association with hiddenness, underworld depth, or narrow danger. By adding lion forelegs and bird-like hind legs, the dragon beast becomes more expansive. It takes the old force of the serpent and gives it the stance of a predator and the grasp of a raptor. The result is a being that seems to draw from multiple domains. The lion rules the ground through muscle and presence. The serpent rules hidden movement and ancient danger. The bird of prey rules through sharpness and elevated precision. The Mushkhushshu gathers all three and places them under divine control. This is why it helps to think of the Mesopotamian sacred animal world not as a zoo, but as a language. Each creature contributes certain meanings. A lion can speak one sentence, a bull can speak another, a serpent can speak a third. The Mushkhushshu speaks by combining those terms into a more complex statement. Babylon did not place it beside lions and bulls by accident. The contrast among them sharpened the meaning of each. Viewers would have seen familiar sacred force in the lion, elemental force in the bull, and then something more composite and elevated in the dragon. The wall becomes not just a display of animals, but a statement about the range of divine authority. There are also the hybrid guardians like the Lamasu, and here the comparison gets especially interesting. The Lamasu, more familiar from Assyrian palace entrances, combine human intelligence, bovine strength, and avian wings. They are monumental, protective, and deeply formal. They do not feel like wild, sacred animals so much as supernatural officials placed on permanent duty. Their bodies are composite, but their role is clear. They guard gates, palaces, and thresholds with a majestic, almost administrative seriousness. The Mushkhushshu differs from them in a revealing way. It is also composite, but it is more animal, more sinuous, more unsettling. It does not feel like a supernatural gate officer. It feels like a divine beast. That distinction matters because it shows the range of Mesopotamian symbolic imagination. Not every protector had to look the same. Some guarding forms emphasized intelligence and monumental stability, as the Lamasu do. Others emphasize sacred force in animal form, as the Mushkhushshu does. Both could belong to systems of protection, kingship, and divine presence, but they worked differently on the viewer. The Lamasu tells you that this threshold is watched by ordered supernatural authority with human-level awareness. The Mushkhushshu tells you that this threshold belongs to a god who commands older and more dangerous forms of power. One is stately, the other is severe. We should also mention the various demonic and protective beings that populate Mesopotamian texts, and ritual life more broadly. The world of the Anunnaki, if we use that phrase in the wider Mesopotamian sense, is never populated by gods alone. There are Apkallu, Utukku, Gallu, Lamasu in other contexts, spirits, underworld beings, protective entities, harmful entities, and strange hybrids that refuse easy sorting. Mesopotamian religion liked a full cast. Some beings were protective, some were dangerous. Some could be either depending on circumstance, ritual control, or textual tradition. Against that background, the Mushkhushshu stands out because it does not feel like a minor spirit or a lurking demon. It has too much dignity, too much formal placement, and too strong a connection to major divine authority. It belongs among the higher symbolic creatures of the system. That dignity is one of the main things that separates it from the genuinely threatening or chaotic beings of Mesopotamian imagination. Demons and hostile spirits are often addressed in incantations, warded off through ritual, described as afflicting the body or disturbing the home, or imagined as forces that need to be banished, contained, or outmaneuvered. The Mushkhushshu is not treated like that. It does not appear as a problem for priests to solve. It appears as part of the official symbolic world that priests, kings, and monumental architecture are willing to display openly. That tells us immediately that it stands on the side of legitimate order, not the side of affliction or rebellion. It is also useful to compare the Mushkhushshu with mythical chaos beasts more broadly, especially those tied to combat myths. The ancient Near East knew perfectly well how to imagine enemies of divine order. Tiamat in the Babylonian creation tradition is the obvious example. a great cosmic enemy associated with primordial watery chaos. Other traditions across the region also imagine storm gods battling serpents, dragons, sea forces, or monstrous rivals. In those stories, the monster represents something that must be overcome so that the world can be made safe, structured, and habitable. That is one very important role for a beast in myth. But the Mushkhushshu does not occupy that role in Babylonian public art. It is not shown being defeated, it is shown aligned. That alone distinguishes it from the real enemies of order. This difference tells us a great deal about Marduk as well. Marduk is the god who defeats chaos and establishes order. His sacred beast therefore does not need to look mild. It can look dangerous precisely because the point is that dangerous force now belongs under his command. The Mushkhushshu is not the chaos dragon outside the walls. It is the divine beast on the walls. It is not the storm to be survived. It is the image of the power that has mastered storms and whatever lies beyond them. That makes it a very sophisticated symbol. It lets Babylon speak the language of divine victory without constantly needing to show a battle scene. The lion, by contrast, can symbolize raw predatory power without necessarily telling that fuller story of cosmic control. The bull can symbolize strength and storm force without necessarily suggesting the same layered command over different realms. The serpent can suggest old sacred energy, but left alone it may remain too ambiguous or too hidden. The Mushkhushshu succeeds because it takes the best symbolic elements of these creatures and arranges them into a beast already fitted for higher service. That is why it does not disappear when set beside other animals. It becomes even more impressive. There is another comparison worth making with eagle or bird imagery. Birds of prey often symbolize vision, elevation, speed, and the ability to strike from above. In Mesopotamian and neighbouring traditions, wings and raptor features frequently carry divine or supernatural force. The Mushkhushshu does not become fully winged in its common Babylonian form, but its bird-like hind legs and talons still import some of that predatory sharpness. This is a subtle but important choice. Instead of making the creature another winged guardian, the artists keep the avian element controlled and partial. That makes the beast stranger. It suggests that the dragon does not need full wings to claim a share in the predatory energy of the sky. This partial borrowing is part of what makes the creature feel so carefully designed. It does not overload itself with features. Many mythical beasts in later traditions go looking for a little too much attention, adding wings, flames, extra heads, and enough spikes to threaten the carpenters. The Mushkhushshu is more disciplined. It borrows what it needs and stops there. That restraint makes it more believable inside Mesopotamian sacred art. It feels like a symbol refined over time rather than an attempt to win a contest for most dramatic creature. It also helps to think about how these different animals would have been experienced by ordinary people. Lions were known as real threats and royal emblems. Bulls were known from agricultural and ritual life as powerful animals of obvious force. Snakes were known as dangerous, uncanny presences near the margins of ordinary safety. Birds of prey were known as hunters from above. So the sacred imagery of the city was built from things people already understood emotionally. The Mushkhushshu was powerful partly because it did not ask viewers to invent a reaction from nothing. It asked them to combine existing reactions. Fear of the serpent, respect for the lion, recognition of divine marking through the horn, unease at the talons. The result is immediate. That immediacy probably mattered a great deal in Babylon's public spaces. A foreign visitor may not know every detail of Marduk's theology, but he knows that a lion is dangerous, a bull is powerful, and the dragon is something beyond both. A local child may not yet know the full liturgical tradition, but she can still absorb the fact that some creatures belong closer to the gods than others. The wall teaches through comparison. By placing the Mushkhushshu beside lions and bulls, Babylon lets the viewer feel the difference rather than merely naming it. This makes the creature a kind of summit form within the broader animal language of empire. It is not the only powerful beast, but it may be the most complete one in symbolic terms. The lion is power, the bull is power, the serpent is power, the dragon is power assembled. That is why it belongs with Marduk rather than simply beside a lesser divine figure. Marduk in Babylonian theology gathers authority. The Mushkhushshu gathers animal force. The pairing is exact. There is also an old Near Eastern habit of linking certain beasts with specific modes of divine or royal presence. Lions can accompany or symbolize aggressive authority. Bulls can signal storm, kingship, and virility. Serpents can mark deep sacred power or dangerous hidden force. Composite guardians can stand at thresholds. The Mushkhushshu seems to sit at the crossroads of all these habits. It is threshold capable, but more beastly than a Lamasu. It is reptilian, but more public and exalted than a simple snake. It is predatory, but more complex than a lion. It is strong, but not through bull-like bulk. That unique combination makes it unusually flexible. It can operate in ritual, architecture, kingship, and theology without ever feeling misplaced. When people today hear creatures of the Anunnaki, they sometimes imagine a whole dramatic hidden bestiary waiting beneath the ruins, as though every Mesopotamian symbol must be evidence of some forgotten prehistoric reptile or off-world animal program. The truth is both calmer and more interesting. The sacred world of Mesopotamia did contain many beings, some protective, some hostile, some divine, some hybrid, some more symbolic than narrative. The Mushkhushshu does not need to be literal in a biological sense to be one of the strongest creatures in that world. Its importance comes from position, association, and meaning. It wins not by being the biggest monster in the room, but by being the right beast in the right company. And what company it is. Lions for Ishtar, bulls for a dad, dragon for Marduk, hybrid guardians at thresholds. Protective spirits in ritual, dangerous demons in incantations, sacred animals and composite forms everywhere the old civilizations needed to speak visually about power. The Mushkhushshu stands among them not as a random curiosity, but as one of the most refined symbols in the whole system. It takes the language others speak and says more with it. That is why the creature remains so memorable. A single lion can be impressive. A single bull can be impressive. A serpent can be ancient and unsettling. But the Mushkhushshu, placed beside them, shows what Mesopotamian thought could do when it wanted to move beyond the ordinary animal world without abandoning it entirely. It makes a beast that still feels rooted in familiar fear and respect, yet belongs unmistakably to the divine sphere. It is the old sacred animal language of the Near East raised to a higher register. By this point, the dragon has stood beside gods, kings, gates, rituals, and the broader beast world of Mesopotamia. It has been compared with lions, bulls, serpents, and hybrid guardians, and the comparisons only make its place clearer. It is not just another creature in the crowd. It is the one Babylon chose to carry Marduk's presence into public view. And once that image had been burned into Imperial memory, there was always going to come a much later moment when the city fell silent. The walls broke, the bricks scattered, and the dragon disappeared from living ritual into buried history, waiting for another age to dig it back into the light. I'm grounding this next section in the real rediscovery story now. Excavation, reconstruction, and where the dragon ended up in the modern world. I'm checking the archaeology and current museum situation so the narrative stays accurate while keeping the same calm flow. I've got the modern arc pinned down now: collapse, excavation, shipment, reconstruction, and where the gate stands today. I'm folding those facts into the same bedtime documentary flow so it still reads like the series, not like a museum label. Thought for 1 minute 27 seconds. For many centuries the dragon disappeared without truly vanishing. That is one of the strange things about ancient cities. They collapse in public and survive in secret. Babylon did not go anywhere in the literal sense. The ground stayed where it was. The broken walls stayed where they fell. The baked bricks remained in the earth, even when the city's voice went silent. But the world that had once known exactly what the Mushkhushshu meant was gone. The priests were gone, the processions were gone, the temple rhythms were gone, the kings who had built in Marduk's name were gone. What remained was ruin, memory, fragments, travellers' reports, and the long, slow work of soil turning a famous city into a problem for later centuries. By the late 6th century BC, after the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the Ishtar Gate had gradually broken down, and what survived most visibly were scattered fragments, rather than a living ceremonial entrance. There is something almost fitting about that. A creature built to stand at the threshold between the human city and divine authority ended up buried at the threshold between memory and forgetting. That does not mean people forgot Babylon entirely. They did not. The city remained famous in text, legend, religion, and later imagination. It survived in Greek writers, in biblical tradition, in medieval echoes, in the dreams of treasure hunters, and in the minds of anyone who hears the phrase Tower of Babel and instantly pictures ancient ambition stacked toward the sky. But fame is not the same as physical clarity. For a long time, Babylon was known more as a place of stories than as a site whose exact monumental life could be seen again in any full way. The dragon remained somewhere beneath that gap, waiting for an age that would come with measuring rods, photography, imperial ambition, and a great deal of confidence in crates. The first modern phase of that return began before the Great Excavation itself. 19th century travellers and early investigators were already trying to understand the mounds at Babylon, and long before the full gate was uncovered, the site had attracted people determined to match ruined ground with famous names from history. By the end of the century, Robert Calderway had noticed fragments of enamelled brick reliefs during visits in 1887 and 1897, clues that later proved to belong to the gate. Formal German-led excavations began in 1899, and the fuller remains of the Ishtar Gate were uncovered in the years that followed, especially between 1902 and 1904, with work continuing until the First World War brought the dig to a halt in 1914. Over the broader span from 1899 to 1917, the excavations revealed not only the gate and the processional way, but also major parts of Babylon's larger sacred and royal landscape. And this is the moment when the Mushkhushshu returns in a form that would have seemed almost impossible to the people who first made it. Not because the dragon came alive again in the old way, not because Marduk's city resumed its festivals, but because modern archaeology began to reassemble the beast from pieces. That is worth pausing over. The Babylonians had made the dragon out of shaped and glazed bricks, each one fitted into a larger visual order. The modern rediscovery had to reverse the process. Archaeologists and restorers found fragments scattered in ruin, identified them, documented them, sorted them, and then slowly rebuilt not the whole original gate in Iraq, but a monumental reconstruction in Berlin. The dragon returned, in other words, through patience rather than ritual, through cataloguing rather than procession, through conservation rather than priesthood. It is one of the strangest resurrections in museum history. The excavation itself was already a massive undertaking. Babylon was not a tidy little site waiting politely to be brushed off. It was a vast field of collapsed architecture, deep deposits, and fragile mud brick remains that required careful and sustained work. Calderway and his team laid tracks to haul away soil and debris, collected tens of thousands of fragments from the gate, and gradually revealed how the structure connected to the processional way and Babylon's broader defensive and ceremonial system. They were not simply finding art objects in isolation. They were uncovering an urban statement, an entire monumental environment in which the dragon had once made sense as part of the city's sacred grammar. That larger context matters because modern museum visitors sometimes meet the Ishtar Gate as a spectacular object and only afterward realise that it once belonged to a much larger lived setting. In Babylon, the Mushkhushshu was not a free-floating masterpiece on a clean wall with labels nearby. It was part of a route, part of an entrance, part of a city's theology in brick. Calderway's work helped reveal that setting again. The excavation showed how the gate stood within a system of walls and approaches, and how the processional way of Marduk connected monumental space to the life of the city. That meant the dragon was not just being rediscovered as an image, it was being returned, at least in outline, to its architectural and ceremonial world. Then came the part of the story that still shapes how the modern world sees Babylon, the movement of fragments out of Iraq and into Berlin. From the excavations between 1899 and 1917, large numbers of glazed brick pieces were sent to Germany, with official museum sources noting that they were awarded to Berlin's museums through artifact distributions, shared with Istanbul in 1903 and Baghdad in 1926. Another scholarly source from NYU's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World notes that Robert Calderway sent almost 800 crates of fragments to Berlin. Once there, the fragments were cleaned, stabilized, sorted by motif and color, and reconstructed into animal reliefs that could be integrated into a monumental museum display. This is where the modern story becomes both impressive and uncomfortable, because it is impossible to separate the return of the dragon from the Imperial age that staged that return. The German excavations were not only about scientific curiosity. Official museum material explicitly places the excavation, acquisition, and handling of the Ishtar Gate in historical context, including the ambitions of the German Empire and the early museum world's desire to obtain major displays for Berlin. The reconstruction of the gate in Germany was therefore an archaeological achievement, a museum achievement, and also part of a much larger story about empire, collecting, ownership, and who gets to house the monumental remains of older civilizations. That tension has never fully gone away, and perhaps it should not. Museums are often places of preservation, scholarship, and public education, but they are also shaped by the political circumstances under which objects were excavated, transferred, and displayed. The Ishtar Gate is one of the clearest examples of that double truth. In Berlin, the reconstruction allowed millions of people to encounter Babylonian art on a scale that would otherwise have been difficult to imagine. At the same time, the very fact that such a major monument left Iraq and became one of the defining attractions of a European museum has long raised questions about cultural ownership, removal, and return. Even when a museum tells the story well, the story it tells includes itself. Still, if we focus for a moment on the reconstruction itself, there is something extraordinary about what was achieved. In Berlin, the brick fragments were desalinated, their glazes reinforced, and teams assembled 72 animal reliefs within just 2 years. Those ancient remains were then joined with modern bricks to reconstruct the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the throne room facades, with the reconstructions first presented to the public when the Pergamon Museum opened in 1930. The museum's own historical material describes this as a visionary reconstruction, and that word is well chosen. What visitors came to see was not the entire original gate removed stone for stone from Babylon, but a reconstruction built from authentic ancient fragments and carefully integrated modern materials. The dragon returned, but returned through modern interpretation. That distinction matters because it changes how we should think about authenticity. The Mushkhushshu in Berlin is real in one sense and mediated in another. The bricks are ancient. The relief fragments are ancient. The arrangement that modern visitors meet is the product of restoration, scholarship, and museum design. It is not a deception. It is a reconstruction, openly so. Yet the effect is still powerful because it restores scale and atmosphere in a way a pile of labelled fragments never could. There is almost a quiet irony here. Babylon once used the dragon to make divine power visible to the public. Berlin used the dragon to make a lost civilization visible to the public. In both cases, the image was doing the work of translation across a gap. For generations, that reconstruction became one of the great museum experiences of Europe. The Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin made the Ishtar Gate and the processional way among its principal attractions, and official museum material still identifies them as such. The dragon, which had once belonged to a processional threshold in Babylon, now belonged to another kind of threshold, one between the modern visitor and the ancient Near East. You entered a museum hall and suddenly found yourself facing the blue world of Nebuchadnezzar again, not in Iraq under open sky, but inside a 20th century building designed to turn archaeology into presence. Yet the story did not end there, because the ruins in Iraq were never erased by the Berlin reconstruction. Official museum and scholarly sources both emphasize that conservation and archaeological work continue at Babylon itself, and UNESCO inscribed Babylon on the World Heritage List in 2019, recognizing it as one of the most influential archaeological and symbolic sites of the ancient world. That means the dragon now lives in two modern conditions at once. Part of its physical survival and public fame is tied to Berlin, while the original site, including earlier unglazed phases and surviving remains at Babylon, belongs to Iraq's own archaeological landscape and ongoing preservation efforts. That split existence gives the Mushkhushshu a remarkably modern afterlife. In antiquity, the creature stood inside a single sacred political order. In modernity, it is distributed across institutions, nations, and debates. One can encounter it through a reconstructed museum monument, through excavation records, through photographs of Babylon's surviving remains, through UNESCO documentation, and through ongoing discussions about provenance and the legacy of Imperial archaeology. The dragon is no longer only a symbol of Marduk city, it is also a symbol of how ancient worlds are recovered, framed, transported, and argued over in the present. There is also something moving about the practical labour behind that return. It is easy to look at a completed reconstruction and forget the immense amount of quiet work hidden inside it. Ancient craftsmen once moulded, glazed, and fired the bricks under Nebuchadnezzar II. Modern archaeologists and restorers then spent years identifying fragments, understanding fitters' marks, sorting colours and motifs, reinforcing glaze, and rebuilding reliefs piece by piece. One scholarly exhibition described the original gate as a monument shaped by expert artisans who could manifest divine power on earth, while the modern reconstruction required another kind of expertise altogether, one less sacred in its own self-understanding perhaps, but still deeply committed to recovering what had been lost. And of course, once a monument enters museum life, it enters a new kind of time. In Babylon, the Mushkhushshu was part of a city built to be lived in, approached and ritualized. In Berlin, it became part of a museum built to be viewed, studied, and preserved. The dragon's meaning shifted with that move. It no longer guarded Marduk's processional space in the old way. It guarded access to historical imagination. It stopped functioning as a live emblem of state religion, and became an object through which modern people could try to picture a world in which state religion once structured everything. That change is enormous, but not total. Even as a museum object, the dragon still carries some of its old force. It still looks like it belongs to power. It still refuses to become ordinary. The modern chapter has its own recent turn as well. As of March 2026, the Pergamon Museum remains completely closed due to major refurbishment, with the museum's official site stating that it is closed until spring 2027. The museum has also explained that some very large objects, including the Ishtar Gate and the processional way, remain on site during construction in climate-controlled protective casing rather than being dismantled and moved. So even in the present moment, the dragon is living through another interval of concealment. Not buried under Babylonian earth this time, but hidden again behind protection, waiting for another public return. That detail feels strangely appropriate. The Mushkhushshu seems to live by intervals of disappearance and reappearance. It stood in Babylon, then vanished into ruin. It returned through excavation, then stood again in Berlin. Now it is temporarily withdrawn behind the needs of conservation and architecture, not lost, but not fully visible either. The creature keeps teaching the same lesson in different ages. Survival is rarely simple. Civilizations fall, museums close, fragments travel, meanings change, and yet some images continue to cross those breaks more successfully than others. The dragon has done that extraordinarily well. There is another reason the modern return matters, and it is not only about archaeology. The rediscovery of the Mushkhushshu changed the modern imagination of the ancient Near East. Before the gate was reconstructed, many people could imagine Babylon only through text and legend. After the reconstruction, Babylon had colour again. It had animals again. It had surface and presence. The dragon helped do that. It reminded the modern world that Mesopotamia was not a dim, abstract civilization of tablets and forgotten kings only. It was also a civilization of strong visual design, bright architecture, technical skill, and symbolic confidence. The return of the dragon returned some of that visual certainty with it. It also changed how people think about mythological creatures. The Mushkhushshu in a text is interesting. The Mushkhushshu in brick at scale is unforgettable. Seeing it reconstructed helps modern viewers understand that ancient composite creatures were not always stray inventions at the edges of belief. Sometimes they were central. Sometimes they were official. Sometimes they stood in one of the most important urban and ritual spaces of a great empire. The museum return makes that harder to miss. It gives the dragon back the dignity of size and repetition, and with that dignity comes a new respect for the symbolic world that produced it. And still, even after the excavation reports, the museum reconstructions, the UNESCO listing, the conservation plans, and the endless photographs, the dragon does not become entirely explained. That is perhaps the most satisfying part of the story. Modern archaeology can tell us when the gate was built, who excavated it, how many fragments were collected, how reconstruction worked, and where the monument stands now. Museums can show us the body of the creature in blue and gold. Scholars can tell us about Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar, ritual, public architecture, and imperial imagery. All of that is valuable, and all of it brings the dragon back into view. But it does not dissolve the final question that seems to hang behind the image. Because once the dragon has returned from ruin into the museum world, once it has crossed from sacred city to global heritage, once it has survived empire, collapse, excavation, transport and restoration, the mind begins to ask a quieter thing. Not whether Babylon made it. We know Babylon made it. Not whether modern archaeologists found it. We know they did. The quieter question is why this creature still feels as though it points beyond itself. Why it still seems to carry memory in a way that a simple decorative motif would not. Why, after all the labels and dates and glass and scholarship, the Mushkhushshu still stands there looking as though it remembers something older than the room around it. As the night settles in, and the room grows a little quieter, it is worth sitting with one last thought about the Mushkhushshu. Not the brick version alone, not the museum version alone, and not only the royal version marching across Babylon's blue walls, but the deeper version that seems to sit behind all of them. The old question has probably been waiting in the back of the mind for a while now. If the dragon was real, then what exactly was ancient humanity remembering? The first answer is the safest one, and also the one most historians would give without much hesitation. Ancient humanity may not have been remembering a literal dragon in the way a modern fantasy story would mean it. It may have been doing something humans have always done very well. It may have been combining what it knew into something that could express more than ordinary life could express on its own. People knew snakes. They knew lions. They knew birds of prey. They knew horns meant power. They knew the world could be beautiful, dangerous, and difficult to control. So they took pieces of that world and assembled them into a creature strong enough to carry their biggest ideas. In that reading, the Mushkhushshu is not a memory of an animal. It is a memory of human thought at work. That is not a disappointing answer, unless a person arrives demanding that history hand over an actual dragon skeleton by sunrise. In fact, it is a much richer answer than it first sounds. It means the creature is real in the way many of the most important human things are real. Law is real, even though you cannot dig up a law in the shape of a bone. Kingship is real, even though no one can weigh the idea of a kingdom on a scale. Fear is real. Authority is real. Sacredness is real inside a civilization that builds life around it. So when ancient people made the Mushkhushshu, they may have been remembering what power feels like when it is too large to fit inside a normal animal. They may have been remembering that danger is part of the world, but also that danger can be arranged, named, and placed under divine order. That alone would be enough to make the dragon worth remembering. Human beings are never simply recording the physical world around them. They are always trying to turn experience into forms they can live with. A storm becomes the sign of a god. A river becomes a boundary between order and disaster. A lion becomes kingship in fur. A serpent becomes hidden power in motion. The Mushkhushshu, in that sense, may be the memory of a civilization trying to make visible something that could not otherwise be shown. It is what happens when a city wants to picture divine authority without reducing that authority to something gentle, domestic, or ordinary. It is memory shaped by need. And yet the mind is often not satisfied with the safest answer, especially at night, especially when the lights are low and ancient things begin to feel slightly less finished than they do in daylight. There is another possibility that has always tempted people, and probably always will. What if the creature was not merely assembled from symbols? What if it carried some fragment of remembered encounter? Not a dragon in the theatrical later sense, not a fire-breathing winged tyrant sleeping on treasure, but some old remembered beast, some real creature magnified by retelling and ritual until it crossed from zoology into sacred art. That thought appears whenever ancient images feel too specific. It appears when a civilization repeats a form with confidence and leaves behind a creature that does not look accidental. The Mushkhushshu has that effect on people. It feels designed, yes, but it also feels stable. It is not a shapeless nightmare. It is not one artist improvising wildly after a difficult lunch. It appears with consistency. It has a body plan. It has a role. It carries itself with the confidence of a thing people recognised. That can make modern viewers wonder whether a long memory sits behind it. A memory of crocodiles seen in strange circumstances, of large reptiles exaggerated in the telling, of bones found in the ground, of stories passed down from distant regions where animals looked different, larger, older, more unnerving. There is no need to force certainty where certainty does not exist. Ancient people did find unusual bones. Ancient people did encounter exotic animals through trade, war, travel, and rumour. Ancient people did retell what they saw until seeing became story, and story became symbol. All of that is normal human behaviour, so it would not be shocking if some part of the dragon's body carried old impressions of real creatures that had passed through memory in altered form. A long reptilian line, a sense of scaled danger, an awareness that there are animals which do not behave like the soft domestic creatures of ordinary life. That much is entirely possible. Still, even if there were some real animal somewhere behind the oldest shadow of the image, the Mushkhushshu that survived into Babylon was already much more than memory of flesh. It had become a memory of meaning. That is an important distinction. The dragon on the Ishtar gate is not just a report of what something looked like. It is a report of what a civilization believed mattered. If an old beast lies somewhere at the root of the story, it was no longer the point by the time Babylon built in blue glaze. The point had become what the creature could say about Marduk, about kingship, about protection, about order, and about the seriousness of sacred space. There is another possibility too, one quieter and perhaps closer to the truth than either a literal dragon or a purely decorative invention. Ancient humanity may have been remembering patterns rather than creatures. Human beings are extremely good at pattern memory. They remember the shape of danger. They remember the look of predation. They remember the feeling that some places are safe and others are not. They remember that power often comes from the ability to combine strengths. The Mushkhushshu gathers patterns the human nervous system already takes seriously. Long-scaled body, sharp claws, forward posture, horned head, predator limbs. Every part of it touches something old in the mind. It may be a creature built from remembered reactions as much as from remembered animals. That would explain why it still works now. Even stripped of ritual, stripped of the temple world, stripped of Marduk's living cult, stripped of the king who wanted the beast close, the image still does its job. A modern person can walk into a museum, see the Mushkhushshu, and feel something immediately. Curiosity, unease, respect, recognition that this is not a harmless decorative flourish. The old code still reaches through. That is because the code is built out of things human beings continue to read. The body still speaks. It speaks through old animal logic. It speaks through posture. It speaks through the assembled language of threat and authority. And that may be what ancient humanity was remembering most faithfully of all. Not a missing species, but the structure of fear. Fear is older than cities. Fear is older than kings. Fear was present long before Babylon fired its blue bricks. But by the time cities emerged, people were no longer content merely to feel fear. They wanted to organise it. They wanted to put it at the gate. They wanted to say which fears belonged outside the walls and which fears had been recruited into the defence of order. The Mushkhushshu may be one of the clearest signs of that process. It is fear reorganised. It is danger standing on the correct side. That is one of the reasons the creature feels so mature compared with many later dragons. Later traditions often enjoy the dragon as an enemy, a hoarder, a challenge for the hero, a dramatic obstacle with excellent publicity. The Mushkhushshu is older in temperament. It is not only there to threaten, it is there to stand in service. That suggests a civilization that was less interested in simply imagining chaos, and more interested in imagining the management of chaos. Mesopotamia was built between rivers that could feed life or destroy it. It was a world of irrigation, war, drought, kingship, labour, walls, and ritual. Of course its dragon would not simply be a rampaging beast. Of course its dragon would belong to administration at the higher sacred level. When people in the modern world use the phrase the dragon of the Anunnaki world, they often mean something dramatic by it. They hear Anunnaki and dragon in the same sentence and immediately feel the tug of hidden history, forbidden memory, pre-flood worlds, strange technologies and old gods who may have known more than humanity was meant to inherit. It is very easy to understand that attraction. Mesopotamia invites it. The landscape of ruins invites it. A creature like the Mushkhushshu invites it especially, because it looks as though it ought to be guarding a secret just one layer below the official explanation. Perhaps in a sense it is. But the secret may be simpler and more human than the louder versions allow. Ancient humanity may have been remembering that people cannot live with chaos unless they give it a face. They cannot survive fear unless they place fear inside a story, a ritual, a symbol, a city wall, a temple threshold, a god's household. The dragon stands there because civilization needed a form sturdy enough to hold that work. It needed something stronger than a tail and more visible than a prayer, so it made a beast that could stand where both tail and prayer met brick. That does not rule out mystery. It only changes where the mystery lives. The mystery does not have to be a missing reptile in a desert valley. The mystery can be the human ability to compress so much into one body. Think about everything the Mushkhushshu has carried for us in this story. Older serpent traditions, Marduk's authority, Babylonian kingship, temple seriousness, threshold protection, public spectacle, imperial confidence, modern archaeology, museum reconstruction, debates about ownership, survival through collapse. That is an enormous amount for one creature to bear, and yet it bears it without seeming overloaded. It still looks exact. It still looks intentional. It still looks as though it knows what it is doing. That can make a person wonder whether ancient people understood symbols better than modern people often do. Perhaps they did. They certainly had more patience for dense meaning. They did not seem embarrassed by the idea that one image could belong to theology, politics, fear, architecture, and ritual all at once. The Mushkhushshu reflects that confidence. It is not worried about being too much. It simply is what it needs to be. In a way, ancient humanity may have been remembering that the world itself is layered like that. Rivers are water and power and danger and boundary and gift and threat all at once. Kings are men and symbols and administrators and performers and servants of the gods all at once. Why should the dragon be any simpler? There is another gentle possibility worth keeping near before sleep. Perhaps what ancient humanity was remembering was not a creature, but a threshold. The dragon stands at thresholds over and over again. Between older gods and newer theology. Between temple and city. Between fear and protection. Between visible animal and invisible meaning. Between ruin and reconstruction. Between ancient ritual and modern museum. That repetition may not be accidental. The Mushkhushshu may endure because it was built to live at the point where one kind of world becomes another. People remember thresholds very well. First cities, first kings, first walls, first floods, first griefs, first gods. The dragon may be the shape given to that feeling that something serious is crossed when one enters ordered life. That thought fits Mesopotamia better than it might fit many other places. Civilization there was always close to its edge. Order had to be maintained. Canals had to be cleared. Walls had to be repaired. Kings had to prove themselves. Offerings had to continue. The divine world had to remain aligned with the human city. Nothing about that system was automatic. It was all work. The dragon, then, may be the remembered face of the fact that order is never free. It is guarded. It is built. It is renewed. And because it is always under pressure, the image that protects it cannot look weak. There is also room for a more personal reading, the sort that arrives late and quietly rather than with a trumpet. Ancient humanity may have remembered its own mind in the dragon. Human beings are composite creatures in a different sense. We are not made of lion legs and serpent scales, but we are assembled from instincts that do not always agree with one another. We want safety and power. We want order and freedom. We fear danger and are drawn to it. We build civilizations and then fill them with symbols of the very forces we claim to control. The Mushkhushshu may feel familiar at some deep level because it behaves like the mind that made it. Part beast, part law, part fear, part authority, part imagination, all held together in one moving body. That may sound too grand if stated badly, but in practical terms it is not grand at all. It simply means that the dragon lasts because it resembles the kind of thinking that built ancient cities. It is not tidy. It is not naive. It does not pretend the world is safe. It does not worship danger for its own sake either. It takes danger seriously and places it under structure. That is what civilization itself tries to do. The Mushkhushshu may therefore be one of the most honest creatures ancient humanity ever made. Not because it depicts a missing animal with documentary precision, but because it depicts how people survive a dangerous world without denying that it is dangerous. And if someone still prefers the wilder thought, the one that imagines older memories, stranger encounters, lost creatures, or some pre-Babylonian line of remembrance reaching back into a darker age, there is no harm in letting that thought sit quietly at the edge of the room for a moment. The ancient world was full of things we only partly understand. Symbols travel farther than texts. Memories outlive explanations. A civilization can forget why it uses an image long after the image has become sacred. That happens even now. So it is not impossible that some distant spark lies behind the dragon, some first impression no one in Babylon itself could have explained fully by the time Nebuchadnezzar raised the gate. The imagination is allowed that possibility, as long as it does not mistake possibility for proof. In the end, though, the most satisfying answer may be the calmest one. If the dragon was real, then ancient humanity was remembering the real pressure of the world and the real need to give that pressure a form. It was remembering predation, awe, danger, kingship, and the hope that divine order could hold them all in place. It was remembering that people live more steadily when the terrifying parts of life are not left shapeless. They are named, they are built into stories, they are stationed at gates, they are placed in service to gods, they are watched, and in some strange way they watch back. That is why the Mushkhushshu still feels alive, even now, even far from Babylon, even under museum light, even in photographs, even in the mind of someone listening half asleep in a very different century. It is not alive because it is waiting to step off the wall. It is alive because the thing it was made to carry has not gone away. Human beings still build systems and hope they hold. They still live beside forces larger than themselves. They still want signs that danger can be governed. They still look for images strong enough to stand between the fragile order of daily life and everything outside it, that does not care whether we rest easily. So perhaps that is the quiet thought to take with you. The dragon may not be a fossil memory of some lost beast in the desert. It may be the memory of humanity learning, very early, that survival depends on more than walls alone. It depends on symbols, on stories, on shared belief, on the ability to look at fear and give it a shape that can stand guard instead of wandering loose in the dark. And once a civilization learns how to do that well, the image it makes can outlive the city, the king, the priests, the language, and almost everything else, leaving only a long-scaled body moving across blue brick somewhere between memory and sleep.